it is late, the room is dark and still. Your body is already heavier than it was an hour ago. The ceiling is the same ceiling it has always been. The sounds from outside, if any remain, have become slow now, indistinct. The way sounds become when the night has settled into its proper depth, and your mind is still here with you. Not always a problem, not always a weight, just present, alert in the way that minds become when the body has finished everything it is supposed to do, and sleep still waits, a little further off than expected. There is a question that arrives at this hour once the surface noise withdraws. Not the logistical ones, those come first and dissolve quickly enough. This question comes after them, quieter, more patient. It has been waiting for a night when you had no choice but to hear it. What in you has not grown old? Not your body. That is a different conversation and not the one for tonight. Not your resume, your responsibilities, the list of things that define you to other people. The question is interior. What in you still moves freely? What still opens rather than closes when something unfamiliar arrives? What in you, even now, even after everything, can still be surprised? Carl Jung spent his life circling this question from different angles. He was a Swiss psychiatrist who lived from 1875 to 1961, and he produced more than most of us will ever read, 20 volumes of collected works, plus the private documents he kept hidden for decades. He was not, in the ordinary sense, an optimistic man. He had seen too much. He sat with too many broken people in too many consulting rooms, listening to what the mind does when it is cornered. But he believed something that took him decades to articulate clearly. He believed that underneath the personality a person shows the world, underneath the habits, the roles, the opinions that calcify over decades of living, there was something that did not calcify. Something the years could not quite reach. He had different names for it at different points in his life. But at the center of all of them was the same intuition, that the psyche, the living interior of a human being, was not designed to finish. Tonight, we explore 5 reasons he believed that. 5 reasons some minds remain young long after the body has stopped being one. 5 reasons that have nothing to do with optimism, with self-improvement, or with refusing to acknowledge difficulty. There is also a 5th reason, and it is the one most people never hear because it asks something of them. We will arrive there in time. Let your body settle where it is. If your mind has something it wants to solve, it can do that in the background. It does not need your full attention right now. We begin. Chapter 2, Why Youth is Not an Age. There is a photograph of Carl Jung taken in 1958. He is 83 years old. He is sitting in a garden in Küsnacht, Switzerland, at the edge of Lake Zurich, in the stone house where he lived for most of his adult life. He is wearing a dark coat. His hands are large and still on his knees. His face is seamed and weathered, the face of someone who has spent decades in close proximity to difficult things. But his eyes are open in the way that certain people's eyes remain open, regardless of what the face around them does. Not wide, not performed, just receiving. As if the world still had things in it worth noticing. He had lost his wife Emma that year. They had been married for 52 years. He would die 3 years later, in June of 1961, and he was, by most accounts, still thinking. Still writing letters to strangers who sent him questions. Still revising his understanding of things he had spent a lifetime considering. Youth, Jung would argue, is not a stage of life. It is a condition of the psyche. And the psyche can maintain certain conditions indefinitely or lose them early. He had seen both. He had worked with patients in their early 30s who were already finished with surprise. Who had decided, somewhere in the daily machinery of their lives, that they knew what the world was and what they were inside it, and who had stopped the slow negotiation that keeps a mind alive. They were not stupid people. They were not unkind. They had simply closed a door they did not know they were closing. And he had met people in their 70s who were still visibly in motion, who read things that disturbed their settled opinions and let that disturbance do its work, who changed their minds without theatre, who remained genuinely curious about the person sitting across from them rather than using that person as a surface to confirm what they already believed. The difference, as Jung traced it over decades of clinical observation, was not intelligence, not education, not even particularly good fortune. It was a relationship. A relationship with the interior, with the parts of the mind that the conscious self does not control and cannot fully see. He called that territory the unconscious. And one of the things he noticed about it in his patients and in his own long private examination of himself was this: it does not age the way the surface does. The surface accumulates. The unconscious renews. There are two kinds of tiredness, and you may be carrying the second one. We will come to that. For now, feel the weight of your body where it rests, your legs, the back of your shoulders. Let that weight be there without adjusting it. The ideas will not move too quickly. Chapter 3. Jung and Inner Renewal. In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung sat alone in a study in Zurich and made a decision that most people in his position would not have made. He had just broken with Sigmund Freud. Not a small disagreement, not a professional difference over a minor theoretical point. A rupture. Freud had been for several years something close to a father figure, a mentor who had shaped the direction of Jung's career and told him more than once that Jung was his designated heir. And then they had ended, in the way significant relationships sometimes end, completely, and with a bitterness that neither quite recovered from. Jung was 38. He was experiencing things in his own mind, voices, images, presences that he could not explain to his own clinical satisfaction. He was a psychiatrist. He knew what it meant, professionally and diagnostically, when a person heard things others could not hear. He had two options. He could diagnose himself, retreat from the edge, and return to solid professional ground. Or he could listen. He chose to listen. He began transcribing what came, the images, the internal figures, the conversations his mind generated in the dark. He drew them. He painted them in extraordinary illuminated pages, bound by hand into what would eventually be known as the Red Book. He showed it to almost no one for decades. It was not published in full until 2009, 48 years after his death. He was not going mad. He was doing something harder. He was treating his own interior as a legitimate territory for serious investigation rather than a liability to be managed. Renewal for Jung always began here, in the willingness to return to what you do not yet understand about yourself. Not with anxiety. Anxiety is a different relationship to the unknown entirely. With something closer to curiosity. The quality you might bring to a text you had not read before, or a landscape you had not yet walked. The mind that renews is the mind that keeps encountering itself as if for the first time. Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst who worked in London from the 1930s through the 1960s, described something adjacent to this. He studied what he called the true self and the false self. The false self was not dishonest exactly. It was adaptive. It learned what the world seemed to require and shaped itself accordingly. It was the version of you that developed in response to what other people needed from you. The true self was more fragile and more fundamental. It existed before the adaptations, before the shaping. In children, it expressed itself through play, through spontaneous, unself-conscious engagement with what was immediately present. In adults, Winnicott observed, the true self went quiet when the false self became too dominant. The person became capable, productive, socially fluent, and quietly empty in a way they could not name. If your mind has been drifting, come back gently. We are still here. Tonight, in a certain sense, we are visiting the true self. The part of you that can sit with a long and quiet conversation in the dark without needing it to be useful. Let your jaw soften. Nothing you hear tonight requires anything of you. Chapter 4, The First Real Reason. Here is the first reason some minds do not harden with age. Curiosity. Not enthusiasm, not optimism, not the practiced brightness of someone who has decided to be interested in things because they believe it is good for them. Something quieter than that, and older. A genuine orientation toward the not yet known. Jung observed, across decades of clinical work, that the patients who aged most rapidly on the inside were not the ones who had suffered most. Suffering, in his reading, could deepen a person, could carve new channels in the psyche and make it larger than it was before. The patients who aged most rapidly on the inside were the ones who had stopped expecting to be surprised. They had arrived at a version of themselves that felt complete, settled. And in that settling, something shut down that is very difficult to reopen. He wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, published in 1933, when he was 58 and had been practicing psychiatry for 3 decades, that the most common neurosis of the second half of life was not anxiety or depression in the ordinary sense. It was a kind of inner emptiness that came from living on the surface, from mistaking the map of the self for the territory, from believing that what you knew about yourself was all there was to know. The curious person does not make that mistake. The curious person maintains, even in old age, the basic posture of a student. Not because they are humble exactly, though that helps, but because they have direct experience of how much they have been surprised before, and they trust that the surprises have not stopped. Socrates, in ancient Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era, made an entire philosophical career out of one observation, that the most dangerous thing a mind could believe was that it had finished learning. He walked the streets of Athens asking questions. Not rhetorical questions, not questions with prepared answers. Genuine questions delivered to generals and tradesmen and poets alike. What is courage? What is justice? What does it mean to live well? Most of his interlocutors began with confident answers and ended in confusion. He counted that confusion as progress. The confusion was not a failure. The confusion was the beginning of real thought. Jung had a name for what fills the space that certainty vacates. He called it the living symbol. A symbol, in his psychology, was not a fixed code where one thing stands for another. It was something alive, something that continued to generate meaning as you lived longer and brought new experience to it. The curious person finds living symbols everywhere. The settled person finds only confirmations. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the mattress or the pillow or whatever surface is holding you right now. We are going deeper into this. Chapter 5: Curiosity Survives Certainty. In the autumn of 1950, Albert Einstein was 71 years old and living in a white clapboard house on Mercer Street in Princeton, New Jersey. He walked to the Institute for Advanced Study most mornings, a 15-minute walk he had made hundreds of times. He had been Einstein for decades at that point, the most famous scientist alive, perhaps the most famous person alive. He had nothing professionally to prove, and no peer who could surprise him with a discovery he could not absorb quickly. And he was still asking questions that he could not answer. He had spent the last quarter century trying to unify general relativity with electromagnetism into a single coherent theory. He did not succeed. He died in 1955 without finishing it. And people sometimes tell that story as a tragedy, the great mind defeated at the end. But there is another way to read it. He chose to spend the last 25 years of his life pursuing something he was not certain he could solve. He stayed at the edge, not in the comfortable interior where everything was already known. He was, in the deepest sense, still curious. Carl Jung would have recognized this. He wrote in a letter to a colleague in the late 1940s that the greatest enemy of psychological growth was not failure, but premature completion. The moment a person decided they had figured themselves out and began to manage their life from that conclusion, rather than remaining genuinely open to its revision. Premature completion is common. It arrives in different disguises. It can look like confidence. It can look like maturity. It can look like the reasonable wisdom of someone who has been around long enough to know how things tend to go. But it feels, from the inside, like a slow narrowing. The world gets a little smaller each year. New information gets processed through old templates rather than genuinely encountered. Other people become more predictable. Your own reactions become more automatic. And somewhere in there, quietly, the question, "I wonder what this means," gets replaced by, "I already know what this means." Jung had a word for what happens to the psyche when curiosity withdraws. He called it enantiodromia, a term he borrowed from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. It means the tendency of things to transform into their opposites when carried to an extreme. The mind that becomes too certain begins to fear uncertainty. The person who stops asking becomes gradually afraid of the questions they have stopped asking. Curiosity is not only pleasant, it is protective. The mind that keeps asking cannot fully close. Feel the air in the room. If you can, notice the temperature on your skin, the parts of you that are uncovered. Just that, just the sensation, the ideas will continue. Chapter 6. Wonder Protects the Psyche. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was a Hungarian-American psychologist who spent his career at the University of Chicago and later Claremont Graduate University, studying a simple question that turned out to be very difficult. What makes people genuinely happy? Not pleased, not comfortable, not satisfied. Deeply, sustainingly happy in the way that leaves a person feeling their life has been well spent. He found that the answer was almost never what people predicted when they were asked beforehand. It was not leisure, not luxury, not the absence of difficulty. It was something he called flow, a state of complete absorption in a task that was neither too easy nor too difficult. The state in which challenge and skill were perfectly matched, so that the person had to extend themselves fully to meet what was in front of them. And he found this state in extraordinarily diverse places. In surgeons mid-operation, in rock climbers 200 feet up a granite face, in chess grandmasters deep in a game, in farmers tending their fields, in children playing alone in a room. What he also found, and this connected his work, though he did not always make the connection explicit, to Carl Jung, was that flow required a particular orientation toward the activity. The person in flow was not detached, they were not performing. They were genuinely engaged in the way that a child is genuinely engaged, fully present to what was happening, with no part of themselves standing outside the experience, judging whether it was worth having. That quality, the capacity to be genuinely present to what is in front of you, is another name for wonder. Wonder is the experience of encountering something and allowing it to be larger than your categories for it. The sunset that is not just a sunset, but something that briefly exceeds your ability to explain it. The piece of music that does something to your chest that music has done before but still surprises you. The face of someone you love, seen clearly after years of ordinary seeing. Jung wrote in Man and His Symbols, the book he completed just before his death, published in 1964, that the symbol-making function of the psyche was essentially the function that transformed ordinary experience into experiences of meaning. The curious person, the wondering person, was constantly activating this function. The world was not just what it appeared to be, it was also what it pointed toward. The person who stops wondering stops receiving those deeper signals. The world flattens. It becomes a series of tasks, of categories already established, of things already named and filed. And the psyche, starved of wonder, goes looking for it in other places, in worry, sometimes, in outrage, in compulsive activity. The hunger does not go away, it simply finds other outlets. Notice your breath right now. Not to change it, just to notice that it is moving, that you are breathing in this room, in this quiet, and that the body does this without your instruction. That is already a small wonder if you let it be. Chapter 7. Mental Clarity Through Openness. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen monk who spent much of his life in exile from his homeland, first in France, then slowly across the world through his teachings, wrote something that clarifies what we mean when we say openness. He did not mean the absence of opinions. He did not mean a kind of formless receptivity that never commits to anything. He meant something more specific, the capacity to encounter this moment as this moment, rather than as a confirmation of what previous moments have taught you. He called it beginner's mind, a phrase that comes from Zen Buddhism, specifically from the Japanese teacher Shunryu Suzuki, who brought it to the West in the 1960s through his teachings at the San Francisco Zen Center. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, Suzuki wrote. In the expert's mind, there are few. This is not an argument against expertise. Expertise matters. Knowing things matters. The surgeon's years of practice are not an obstacle to good surgery. They are necessary to it. But expertise can harden into a kind of template thinking that stops the mind from seeing what is actually in front of it. The doctor who has seen thousands of cases may stop seeing the patient. The teacher who has taught for decades may stop seeing the student. The person who has been married for 20 years may stop seeing the person they married or the person that person has become. Mental clarity, in this sense, is not about having clear answers. It is about having a clear relationship to experience. It is about being able to encounter something freshly rather than through the accumulated residue of past encounters. Jung called this the suspension of the known attitude. He described it in his 1935 lectures at the Tavistock Clinic in London as the first requirement for any genuine psychological work. The willingness to sit with a symbol, a dream, an image, without immediately reaching for the interpretation you already have on hand. This is harder than it sounds. The mind wants to recognize. Recognition is efficient. It allows you to move quickly through a world full of data. But the cost of constant recognition is the loss of encounter. You stop meeting things. You start confirming things. The open mind is the mind that can still be met, and the mind that can still be met is, in the most important sense, still young. Let your eyes close fully if they are not already closed. Let your thoughts do what they do. They are clouds in a wide sky. They cross and dissolve, and you remain here, beneath them. Chapter 8. When adults stop seeing. A man in his late 50s who commutes by train from a suburb into a city he has worked in for 30 years, takes the same route, in the same seat, past the same views, 5 days a week. He reads during the journey, or he looks at his phone, or he looks out the window without seeing what is there. At some point in those 30 years, the view became invisible, not because it changed, or not only because it changed, but because he had filed it. He had placed it into the category of the view from the train and no longer processed it as an actual landscape. On a Tuesday morning in November, a particular November, wet and cold, the kind of morning that is difficult to distinguish from any other morning in that season, a gap in the clouds opens briefly over the marsh that the train passes at 8:14. The light comes through in a single shaft and falls on the reed grass and the standing water. It lasts perhaps 12 seconds before the train rounds a bend and the clouds close again. He does not see it. 3 seats away, a woman who has never taken this train before, she is visiting from elsewhere, she has a window seat, she is still in the stage of the journey where everything is new, watches those 12 seconds of light on the marsh and holds the image in her mind for the rest of the morning. Carl Jung would not moralize about this. He would not say the man should try harder to notice things. He would say something more structural. He would say that the man's relationship to that train journey has become unconscious. Not unconscious in the sense of hidden or repressed, but in the sense of automatic, below the threshold of active attention, filed. And that filing is not only about train journeys, it extends. The people in your life become filed. Your own thoughts become filed. Your body becomes filed, something you occasionally check in with when it hurts and otherwise process as background. And the world shrinks, room by room, from something encountered to something managed. The antidote Jung consistently pointed toward was not effort. It was attention. Voluntary, interested attention brought back to things that had been allowed to go automatic. He wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the autobiographical work assembled in the final years of his life and published in 1962, that what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming genuinely oneself, required a constant returning of attention to the interior, a refusal to let the known settle into the permanently settled. Let the small things be what they are tonight. The temperature of the air, the sound of your own breathing, the particular quality of the quiet in this room, which is different from any other quiet in any other room. We continue. Chapter 9. Symbols keep the mind alive. Jung devoted a significant portion of his career to a concept that contemporary psychology has largely set aside, and which is worth returning to in the context of what keeps a mind alive. He was fascinated by symbols, not signs. Signs are arbitrary agreements where one thing stands for another and could just as well stand for something else. The letter A stands for a sound. A red octagon stands for stop. Signs are efficient and interchangeable. Symbols in Jung's usage were different. A symbol was an image or a word or a figure that contained more meaning than any definition could exhaust. The cross in Christianity, the mandala in Buddhist practice, the dragon in the mythologies of dozens of unconnected cultures, the wise old man who appears in dreams across traditions and throughout history. These were not interchangeable. They carried something that rational definition could approach but never fully contain. He wrote about this most accessibly in Man and His Symbols, the book he finished in 1961, the year of his death, a book he had resisted writing for years because he was not sure he could address the general reader without losing precision. He finally agreed to write it after a dream convinced him he could. He completed the final chapter 10 days before he died. His argument about symbols and psychological health was this: the psyche, in full and healthy operation, is always producing symbols, always generating images that carry more meaning than the conscious mind can immediately account for. Dreams are full of them. Significant encounters are full of them. Art and literature and music are full of them. The person who remains open to this symbolic dimension of experience remains in contact with a source of meaning that does not run out. Every encounter with genuine literature, with Dostoevsky, with Rilke, with Homer, is an encounter with a living symbol. It does something that cannot be reduced to information. The person who loses contact with the symbolic dimension does not stop needing it. They begin to find it in other places, in compulsive watching, in obsessive news consumption, in the frantic search for something that feels significant. The hunger is for symbol. The food is whatever is available. Feel the weight of the blanket or the sheet over you. That is a real physical thing. And in this moment, it is also something else, something that says, you are held. The world has arranged itself around your rest. That is a small symbol. It is enough. Chapter 10. Dreams refuse to grow old. Let us pause here for a moment. Not to meditate, not to solve anything, just to let the body know that we are with it. Right now, your body is doing everything it needs to do. Your breath is moving at its own pace. Your heart is beating without asking for your supervision. The muscles in your face and your hands and your feet are softening the way muscles soften when the mind begins to loosen its grip. You do not have to do anything for that to be true. Let your attention rest for just a moment on the place where your body feels heaviest. Your legs, perhaps. The back of your head against the pillow. Your shoulders. Just notice. Just be in contact with that weight. Now, when you are ready, come back. Jung's central observation about dreams, the observation that shaped his entire theoretical project, was this: The unconscious does not speak in the language of the conscious mind. The conscious mind works with concepts, with cause and effect, with categories and definitions, and the orderly arrangement of what is known. It follows the rules of Aristotelian logic. A thing cannot be itself and its opposite at the same time. One event precedes another in time. Identity is stable. Dreams follow none of these rules. In dreams, you are yourself and someone else simultaneously. Your mother becomes your house, becomes your childhood friend, becomes a stranger. Time moves in all directions or does not move at all. The dead speak. The impossible is ordinary. The most painful things in your life appear as images that are vivid and strange and, sometimes, deeply beautiful. The unconscious, Jung argued, produces these images according to its own logic, a logic that is older than rational thought, and that serves a different function, not to explain, to compensate, to bring into view what the conscious mind has suppressed, denied, neglected, or simply not yet encountered. And here is the relevant point for tonight's question. The unconscious does not age. It does not accumulate the barnacles of habit and confirmation bias that coat the conscious mind over decades. It remains, in its imagery and in its compensatory function, as fresh as it was when you were 12, as wild, as willing to surprise. This is why the person who maintains a genuine relationship with their dream life, not through forced interpretation, but through simple attention and interest, tends to stay in contact with a part of themselves that resists the aging of certainty. The dream refuses the settled conclusion. It keeps reopening what the conscious mind wants to close. We are a quarter of the way through our first reason. Curiosity has many rooms. We step into the next one. Chapter 11. The second real reason. The second reason some minds do not harden with age is this. They remain, in a specific psychological sense, flexible, not spineless, not without conviction. Flexible in the way that living wood is flexible, which is not the same as being soft. Living wood bends in the wind and returns to its shape. Dead wood cracks. Carl Jung spent years developing a vocabulary for what psychological flexibility actually meant in clinical terms, because the word itself, flexible, is easy to say and surprisingly hard to locate in practice. He found it easier in the end to define what it was not. It was not agreeableness. The most flexible people he worked with were often quite willing to disagree, to hold an unpopular position, to resist social pressure without aggression, but with quiet steadiness. Agreeable people are sometimes the most rigid of all, because they have no interior relationship to their own position. They simply mirror whatever surrounds them. It was not impulsiveness. The person who changes their mind every time the wind shifts has not demonstrated flexibility. They have demonstrated the absence of a center. Psychological flexibility, in Jung's understanding, was something closer to this. The capacity to hold your current understanding of yourself and the world provisionally, seriously but provisionally, while remaining genuinely open to evidence that it requires revision. This is harder than it sounds, because the current understanding of yourself is not just a set of opinions you carry in your head. It is your identity. The story you tell about what you have been through, what it means, what it has made you. And when new evidence challenges that story, it does not feel like an intellectual revision. It feels like a threat. The flexible person has developed the capacity to tolerate that feeling, to sit with the disorientation of identity revision without either immediately capitulating or immediately defending. To stay in the in-between long enough for something new to form. There is a hidden bargain that the mind makes at night, a bargain we will come to. It has something to do with this. Feel the air moving through your nose or your mouth. Just that, the temperature of it, slightly cooler going in, slightly warmer coming out. The body has been doing this for a very long time. It is very good at it. We continue. Chapter 12. Flexibility of the unconscious. The reason the unconscious is more flexible than the ego, Jung's term for the conscious organizing center of the personality, is structural. The ego, by definition, is the part of the mind that knows who it is. It maintains identity across time. It is the part that wakes up in the morning and picks up where it left off yesterday, that has preferences and opinions and a history and a name. It is necessary. Without it, there is no stable ground from which to operate in the world. But its necessity becomes a limitation when maintained too rigidly. The ego that is very certain of itself stops processing information that contradicts its self-image. It becomes, in a clinical sense, a filtering mechanism, passing through what confirms it and deflecting what challenges it. Jung called this the persona identification trap. The person who has become so identified with their social role, their professional identity, their carefully constructed self-image, that they can no longer distinguish between the role and themselves. The unconscious has no such investment. It carries everything, including everything the ego has rejected, the unlived possibilities, the fears that were never examined, the grief that was set aside because there was no time for it, the capacity for joy that was considered immature, the anger that was considered unacceptable. None of that disappears. The unconscious is not a garbage bin. It is more like a storage room in a large house, accessible by a door the ego has learned not to open. The contents are still there. They are still active. They exert pressure. And periodically, in dreams, in unexpected emotional reactions, in the particular obsessions and fears that arrive without obvious provocation, the contents of that room make themselves known. The psychologically flexible person has some access to this room. Not full access, that is probably not possible and would not be desirable, but they maintain enough of a relationship with their interior that the stored material does not accumulate to the point of crisis. They can revisit and revise. They can let some things out and let them be different from what they were when they were put away. Erik Erikson, the German-American developmental psychologist who worked in the mid-20th century and developed the famous 8 stages of psychosocial development, described this as the difference between stagnation and generativity in midlife. Stagnation was the condition of the ego that had stopped growing, that had achieved its goals and then turned inward, becoming preoccupied with its own maintenance. Generativity was the condition of the person who had found a way to remain creative, contributive, still in productive relationship with the larger world and the people coming after them. The flexible unconscious makes generativity possible. The rigid ego makes stagnation almost inevitable. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the width of your back where it rests. The ideas are settling. Chapter 13. The ego ages faster. There is a simple observation buried in Jung's clinical writing that is worth bringing forward explicitly. The ego ages faster than the psyche. What he meant by this, the conscious, managing, identity-maintaining part of the mind is subject to social pressure, to accumulated habit, to the slow hardening that comes from making the same choices repeatedly until they feel like the only choices. It is subject to what the sociologist Erving Goffman called impression management, the continuous, largely unconscious work of presenting a coherent self to the world. That work is exhausting, and over decades it produces a kind of calcification. The self that began as something flexible and provisional, capable of being one thing in the morning and a slightly different thing by evening, capable of genuine surprise, of contradiction, of not quite knowing, that self becomes more and more definitively what it already is. The psyche, Jung argued, does not participate in this process in the same way. The deeper layer, what he called the self, with a capital S to distinguish it from the smaller ego, operates on a different timescale and by different rules. It is not trying to impress anyone. It is not maintaining a consistent story. It is simply generating images, compensating forces, new material for growth. This is why people who undergo what used to be called a midlife crisis, Jung would have called it a midlife transformation, often describe the experience as a kind of thawing. Something that had been frozen begins to move. Not always pleasantly, not always without damage, but with a quality of authenticity, of returning to something real, that the frozen years had not offered. The ego's aging is visible in specific ways, in the increasing preference for the familiar, in the growing irritation at things that used to be merely inconvenient, in the shortening of the window of genuine attention to new information, in the tendency to finish other people's sentences not from intelligence, but from impatience with the unpredictability of what they might actually say. And the antidote is not willpower. The ego cannot decide to be young. What it can do, what the work Jung described always came back to, is maintain a genuine relationship with the deeper layer. To let the psyche's ongoing generativity inform and, when necessary, disrupt the ego's settled certainties. Notice where your body feels tight right now. Not to fix it, just to acknowledge that the body holds things too, that the muscles remember. Let your breath find its own rhythm. Chapter 14. Why rigidity exhausts the soul. A woman in her mid-40s runs a small business she founded in her 30s. She is good at it. She has built a system that works, a set of processes and decisions and responses that she has refined over more than a decade until they are close to optimal. She can handle almost any situation that arises without losing composure, because she has learned through experience how situations like this tend to go. She is, in the conventional sense, a successful person. And she is deeply, quietly exhausted. Not physically exhausted, she sleeps adequately, she exercises, her health is reasonable. The exhaustion is something else, something that does not improve after a holiday. Something that she notices most clearly on Sunday evenings when the weekend's relative freedom is ending and the week ahead is crystallizing in her mind into a known sequence of familiar demands. Carl Jung would have recognized this exhaustion immediately. He would have called it the exhaustion of the one-sided personality. The one-sided personality, in Jung's framework, is the person who has developed one mode of being, one function, one set of responses to such a degree of efficiency that the other modes have been left undeveloped. The woman who founded the business is a thinking type in Jung's terminology, oriented toward analysis, judgment, efficiency, outcome. Those capacities have been honed and honed, and the undeveloped functions, feeling, intuition, the capacity for play, for non-instrumental relationship, for experience that is not oriented toward a result, have been compressed into a smaller and smaller space. The compressed functions do not disappear. They turn up as moods, as physical symptoms, as dreams, as vague dissatisfactions that rational analysis cannot resolve. And the effort of maintaining the dominant function, of running the business, of being competent, of meeting the world with a consistent and effective face, becomes greater over time because it is being done against the increasing pressure of everything that has been left out. Rigidity is not only psychologically limiting, it is metabolically expensive. The psyche spends enormous energy maintaining a one-sided position. The antidote is not abandonment of the developed capacity. The developed capacity is valuable. Often, it is what allows a person to contribute something real to the world. The antidote is integration, the slow, patient process of allowing the undeveloped functions to find expression alongside the dominant one. A flexible psyche is a less exhausted psyche, not because life gets easier, because the energy is no longer spent fighting your own interior. Feel the surface beneath you, its solidity, its support. Let that solidity be enough for now. Chapter 15, Anxiety Loves Fixed Identities. Søren Kierkegaard walked the streets of Copenhagen in the 1840s, nearly every day, in the company of his own thoughts. He was a small man, slight in frame, known to strangers by his distinctive silhouette, the pronounced curvature of his spine, the rapid walking pace, the notebook he often carried. He was, by most accounts, not comfortable to be around. He was brilliant, provocative, and inclined to examine everything that other people preferred to leave unexamined. He wrote, in The Concept of Anxiety, published in 1844, that Anxiety, what he called angst in Danish, was not the result of a particular danger, it was the result of freedom. Specifically, the vertigo that a person experiences when they realize that they must choose what they will become and that the choice is genuinely open. The fixed identity is, in part, a defense against this vertigo. If I know who I am, if my identity is settled and solid, if the categories are established and the walls are up, then the dizziness of open possibility is contained. I do not have to stand at the edge and look down. I already know what I am. I already know how I will respond to what comes. The uncertainty has been domesticated, but the defense has a cost. The fixed identity cannot grow without cracking, and the anxiety that was suppressed by the fixing does not disappear. It relocates. It becomes the anxiety of maintaining the fixed identity, the constant background work of ensuring that the story holds, that the self-image is not contradicted, that the categories do not collapse. This anxiety is familiar to most people who have reached middle age. It is the anxiety of the person who has become good at being themselves in a particular limited sense, and who senses, without wanting to examine the sensation too closely, that there is more in them than the container allows for. Jung's response to this was individuation, a process, not a destination, a continuous movement toward becoming more fully what you actually are, as distinct from what you have learned to perform. It requires, at the outset, a tolerance for the vertigo that Kierkegaard described, a willingness to not know who you are for long enough to find out. The room is quiet, you are safe in it. Whatever is unresolved in you tonight does not need resolving right now. It can wait in the dark while you rest. Chapter 16. The persona turns stale. Jung borrowed the word persona from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient Roman theatre. Each mask represented a character: the old man, the young lover, the villain, the fool. The actor wore the mask and became, temporarily and for the audience's purposes, that character. The psychological persona, in Jung's framework, is the mask we develop for social performance. The professional self, the friendly self, the competent self, the reliable self. All the faces we present to different social contexts. This is not pathological. It is necessary. The persona is the interface between the interior and the social world. Without it, every social encounter becomes an overwhelming exposure of everything you are simultaneously, which would be paralyzing. The problem is not the persona. The problem is identification with the persona, the gradual process by which the mask begins to feel like the face. When does a persona turn stale? When it stops being a chosen interface and starts being an automatic constraint. When the professional self follows you home and cannot be taken off at the door. When the reliable self becomes unable to admit to being tired or wrong or uncertain, not because admitting these things would be strategically unwise, but because the admission feels physically impossible. When the friendly self smiles at things it is not amused by, not as a social choice, but because it has forgotten what genuine amusement feels like. The stale persona is the psyche's equivalent of a garment worn so long it has shaped itself to the body. You can no longer tell, looking at it, where the garment ends and the body begins. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked closely with Jung for many years and became one of the most important interpreters of his psychology, described the stale persona as one of the primary obstacles to psychological development in the second half of life. The person has invested so much in building and maintaining the social face that the idea of loosening it feels catastrophic. As if without the mask there would be nothing, or as if what is underneath is too unsightly to be shown. Neither is typically true. What is underneath the stale persona is usually simply the person, imperfect, uncertain, more alive than the mask allows. Feel the weight of your body where it is heaviest. That weight is real. That weight is yours. It belongs to no one's image of you, just the body, here, at rest. Chapter 17. Living Beyond One Role. A man retired after 41 years as a structural engineer with a firm in a city he had moved to in his late 20s. He had been good at his work. He had known for those 41 years what the day was for. It had a shape, an early alarm, the drive, or the train, the building, the colleagues, the problems with solutions, the return. The shape was predictable, and in its predictability it was a kind of comfort. He retired on a Friday in June. The party was pleasant. People said the right things. He cleared his desk with the combination of efficiency and suppressed emotion that characterized how he had approached most significant transitions. On the following Tuesday morning, with no alarm, no destination, and a calendar entirely empty for the first time in decades, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and felt invisible. Not sad, exactly. Not depressed. Invisible. As if, without the context that had organized his days for 4 decades, some part of him was no longer legible, not to the world and not quite to himself. Jung had a name for this experience. He called it the loss of the carrier, the external structure that had been carrying a significant portion of the personality. When the carrier disappears, the personality material that it carried must be carried some other way, or it dissipates. The structural engineer had not been only an engineer. He had been curious, patient, systematic, proud in the right way, capable of quiet satisfaction in things done well. The engineering had carried all of those capacities and given them form and purpose. Without it, the capacities were still there but had nowhere to go. The second half of Jung's work, the part that addressed what he called the afternoon of life, was concerned precisely with this transition, with the question of how a person carries what they are when the external structures that previously carried it are no longer available. His answer, consistently, was the interior. The relationship with the self, with the ongoing process of individuation, could serve as a carrier when all the external carriers fell away. Not as a replacement for the world, but as a ground that the world's changes could not erode. The engineer, 18 months later, was teaching mathematics at a community college 2 mornings a week. Not because he needed to, because he had found, to his own surprise, that explaining things to people who were trying to learn something was something he had always loved, and the engineering had carried that love without his ever having named it separately. Let your jaw soften. Let the night be what it is. Chapter 18. Inner change prevents decay. The opposite of psychological growth is not stability. It is decay. Jung was careful about this distinction because stability, real stability, the stability of a person who knows who they are and can be counted on, is valuable and not to be confused with stagnation. A person can be deeply stable and still growing. The two are not in conflict. What decays is the psyche that stops growing because it has decided that growth is finished, that there is nothing left to become, nothing left to understand, no revision of the self left to be made. The French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who lived from 1533 to 1592, spent the years from 1571 onward in a tower on his estate near Bordeaux, writing the essays for which he is still read, the first essays in the modern sense, attempts at honest self-examination in a genre he invented almost entirely alone. He began after a period of devastating personal losses. His closest friend, Etienne de la Boétie, had died. His father had died. His first child had died in infancy. He was 38. And rather than turning outward to distraction or inward to self-destruction, he turned inward to investigation. The tower, lined with books and inscribed on the ceiling beams with quotations from Seneca and Lucretius and others, became a laboratory. The subject was Montaigne himself. What he found over the next 20 years of writing surprised him. The self he had gone to examine was not fixed, it was in constant motion. "I do not portray being," he wrote. "I portray passing." Every attempt to pin himself down produced a portrait that was already slightly wrong by the time it was finished. He was not the same person in the morning that he was at midday. He did not experience this as an instability. He experienced it as the truth of what it is to be alive. Inner change in this sense is not volatility, it is responsiveness, the capacity of the interior to continue metabolizing experience, to let what happens to you become part of what you are, rather than an accumulation of hardened sediment. The mind that remains in this kind of living relationship with its own experience does not grow old in the way we are describing, it grows deep, which is a different thing entirely. Something shifts here. We have been in the second reason for some time. The ideas are settling. And now, the third. Chapter 19, the third real reason. The third reason some minds refuse to grow old is this. Play still lives in them. Not the performance of play. Not the conscious cultivation of hobbies for health reasons, or the scheduling of fun because someone read an article about the importance of fun. Something more fundamental, the capacity for experience that is intrinsically valuable, that needs no justification, that is engaged in for no other reason than that it is engaged in. Children understand this without having to think about it. A child in a garden with a stick and a patch of dirt is engaged in something that cannot be improved by adding a reason for it. The stick is the stick. The dirt is the dirt. The playing is the playing. It does not need to be useful. Adults lose this, or most do. There is a moment, usually sometime in the second decade of life, when play begins to require justification. It must be productive play, learning a skill, or social play, building relationships, or competitive play, winning something. The pure, unmotivated engagement with what is immediately present begins to require a reason, and once a reason is required, the quality of the experience has already changed. Carl Jung did not write extensively about play in the way that a developmental psychologist like Winnicott or Piaget might have, but it appears importantly in his autobiographical writing. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes a period in his late 30s, during the years of the Red Book, during the time he describes as his confrontation with the unconscious, when he began, deliberately, to play. He went to the lake shore near his house in Kusnacht. He gathered stones. He built things with them, miniature structures, a village, a church. He did this day after day. He was a 40-year-old psychiatrist, a respected figure, a man who had written serious books about serious subjects. He built things with stones on a lake shore in Switzerland. He wrote that something in him that had been blocked began to move when he did this, that the activity, purposeless, childlike, slightly embarrassing, opened a channel that the serious professional work had closed. The stone buildings became the imaginative foundation for much of the clinical work that followed, not as a plan, as an opening. Feel where your hands are right now. Notice the stillness in them. The body knows how to rest. It has always known. Chapter 20. Play Still Lives Within. Donald Winnicott believed that the capacity for play was the most important single indicator of psychological health. More important than the absence of symptoms. More important than functional effectiveness. More important than intelligence or adaptation or even happiness in the ordinary sense. In his consulting room in London in the 1950s and 1960s, he worked with both children and adults. With adults, he often used what he called scriggle games. He would make an arbitrary mark on a piece of paper and ask the patient to make it into something. Then the patient would make a mark and he would complete it. The exercise sounds childlike. It was clinically revealing. What he was testing was the patient's capacity to play, to engage in a symbolic, open-ended activity without needing to control the outcome or protect themselves from the unpredictability of the process. Patients who could play in this sense, who could follow the squiggle wherever it went, who could be surprised by what emerged, were patients who had maintained access to the true self. Patients who could not play, who immediately made the mark into something recognizable, something controlled, something safe, were patients in whom the false self had become dominant. The false self cannot play, because play requires genuine openness to outcome. And the false self is, by definition, outcome managing. This has a direct bearing on what keeps a mind young. The mind that can still play, in whatever form that takes, is the mind that has maintained its relationship with the part of the psyche that remains genuinely open. The part that does not know how this is going to turn out, and finds that uncertainty interesting rather than threatening. Play in adults takes forms that do not always announce themselves as play. Genuine conversation, not the exchange of positions, but the kind of conversation where you do not know what you think until you have said it, and then it surprises you. Reading that proceeds without a goal, book opened, followed wherever it goes. Closed when the mood changes. Walking without a route. Cooking something for the first time from a recipe you are not sure will work. Making something with your hands that does not need to be good. The stakes are low. That is precisely the point. When the stakes are low, the ego relaxes its oversight. And when the ego relaxes its oversight, something else gets to speak. Notice your breath again, just for a moment. The small rise and fall of the chest or the belly, if that is where you breathe. You do not need to do anything. You are already doing exactly what needs to be done. Chapter 21. Seriousness is not wisdom. There is a confusion that afflicts adults especially, and that tends to worsen with age. It is the confusion between seriousness and wisdom. Seriousness is a quality of manner. Gravitas, weight, the appearance of depth. It is what people mean when they say someone carries themselves well or commands respect. It is a social technology and a useful one. It signals that what you have to say is worth attending to. In certain contexts, medicine, law, the boardroom, the consultation room, it is genuinely appropriate. But seriousness is not wisdom. Wisdom involves having learned something from the full range of experience, including, and this is the part that seriousness tends to suppress, the experience of being wrong, foolish, surprised, playful, and wrong again. Wisdom requires the integration of what has not gone well alongside what has. Seriousness often consists precisely in the suppression of that integration. The person who confuses seriousness for wisdom begins to experience play as threatening. It is undignified. It does not fit the self-image of someone who has earned their gravity through years of serious engagement with serious things. The child inside them, who Jung would say has not gone anywhere, has simply been made to wait outside, begins to seem like an embarrassment rather than a resource. G.K. Chesterton, the English writer who worked in the early 20th century, made this observation with characteristic precision. The true object of all human life is play. Earth is a task garden. Heaven is a playground. He was, in his usual way, saying something that sounds like a joke and is not quite one. He meant that the striving, task-oriented mode of adult life was a means, not an end, and that we consistently mistake the means for the end, and then wonder why we are exhausted and unsatisfied after a life of effective striving. Jung's collected works contain an observation buried in a passage about alchemy and psychological transformation that speaks to this. He noticed that alchemists, medieval European philosophers who worked with the symbolic transformation of base metals into gold, and who he read as encoding in symbolic language, the process of psychological individuation often described the work as ludus puerorum, the play of children. The highest, most serious work of the psyche was, they suggested, also somehow the most childlike. Not because it was easy, because it required the same quality of unself-conscious engagement with process without predetermined outcome that a child brings to a stick and a patch of dirt. Let your thoughts be what they are. Let them play in the background while you rest. Chapter 22. The child archetype returns. In the Jungian framework, an archetype is a preformed pattern, a deep structure of the psyche that shapes how we experience certain fundamental human situations. The mother archetype shapes how we experience being cared for. The shadow archetype contains what we have refused to acknowledge about ourselves. The hero archetype organizes the experience of facing a decisive challenge. The child archetype is one of the most important. Jung wrote about it in an essay of 1940, The Psychology of the Child Archetype, where he described it as representing, among other things, futurity, the orientation toward what is not yet, toward the open. The child archetype is the part of the psyche that has not yet decided, that still exists in a state of genuine potentiality. It appears in dreams often, the small child discovered in an unexpected room of a house, the forgotten child that needs to be found. The infant that the dreamer suddenly realizes they have left somewhere and must return for. These images, Jung argued, were not to be taken literally. They were not about literal children or literal neglect. They were about the relationship between the conscious self and the potential it has abandoned. When the child archetype is suppressed, when the ego has decided that potential is closed, that what is what will be, that the future is simply the past extended. The psyche experiences this as a kind of grief, a sense of loss without a clear object. A nostalgia that is not quite for any specific time or place, but for a quality of experience, the quality of genuinely open possibility. This grief is common in the second half of life. It often gets misidentified as depression, or as a crisis of meaning, or as regret for specific choices. Those things can be real. But underneath them often is the suppressed child archetype, the part of the psyche that is not asking for the past to be recovered, but for the future to be reopened. The reopening, Jung consistently argued, does not happen through regret. It happens through the small, unassuming acts of genuine engagement with the present, the curiosity, the play, the wonder we have been discussing, that signal to the deeper psyche that the door is not finally shut. The body is heavy and warm and still. The room is quiet. If you are still awake, These are the ideas I wanted you to hear. Chapter 23: Creativity Against Inner Dryness. There is a condition that Jung sometimes described as inner dryness, a state of psychological aridity in which the mind has lost its capacity to be nourished by experience. It is different from sadness. Sadness retains its relationship with what has been lost. It is, in that sense, still alive, still oriented towards something that mattered. Inner dryness is something else. It is the state of having lost the capacity to matter. The things that used to move the person no longer move them. Music that used to mean something has become pleasant or unpleasant sound. Reading that used to be absorbing has become something to be gotten through. The face of someone beloved has become familiar without being, in the immediate moment of looking at it, surprising. The treatment, in Jung's clinical experience, was almost always creative activity. Not necessarily art, not necessarily anything that would be recognized as creative from outside. Simply the act of making something, of engaging with materials and process in a way that had an open outcome. He had patients who began to draw for the first time in their 50s, who learned to throw pots, who planted gardens, who began writing things they intended to show no one. The medium was not the point. The act was the point. The act of allowing something in the interior to externalize itself in the world, to become visible in a form that could then be examined, revised, or simply held. Creative activity, in this sense, is the psyche speaking to itself through a medium that is not language. It bypasses the ego's control, because you cannot fully predict what you will make before you make it. And in bypassing the ego's control, it allows material from deeper layers to come forward. Rilke, the Austrian poet who lived from 1875 to 1926, and who produced some of the most extraordinary poetry in the German language, wrote his Duino elegies over a 10-year period of extraordinary intermittency, bursts of composition separated by years of silence. He described the poems as arriving from somewhere he could not reach through effort, only through a kind of patient openness. The waiting was not passive, it was active. He was preparing conditions in which something could come. Every person who maintains a creative practice in some form, however modest, however private, is engaged in this same preparation. They are keeping a channel open, and an open channel does not go dry. Let your body sink a little deeper into whatever is beneath it, the floor, the mattress, the chair. Let gravity do its work. You are being held. Chapter 24: Emotional Healing Through Imagination. One of the most counterintuitive aspects of Jung's clinical practice was the role he gave to imagination, not as a diagnostic tool, not as a way of understanding what was happening in the unconscious, but as a direct therapeutic intervention. He called it active imagination. It was a method he developed in the years following his break with Freud, during the period of his confrontation with his own unconscious. And it worked like this. The person would allow an image from a dream, from a daydream, from a mood or a physical sensation to be held in the mind's eye. And then they would engage with it. Not analyze it, engage with it. Speak to it. Allow it to speak back. Follow it wherever it went. This sounds, from the outside, like something between meditation and writing fiction. It is neither exactly. It is something older, the kind of interior dialogue that human beings seem to have engaged in across cultures and throughout history, in different forms and under different names, as a way of processing what rational analysis cannot reach. The emotion that lives in the body, the grief that has never been properly grieved, the anger that was swallowed because there was no safe place for it, the fear that has been managed but not resolved. These things are not well served by explanation. Knowing why you feel something does not in most cases dissolve the feeling. It contextualizes it. It gives the conscious mind a story. But the feeling remains in the body, available to be triggered, waiting. Active imagination, in Jung's method, gave the feeling a form and then engaged with the form. The grief was not explained, it was met. The anger was not rationalized. It was given voice in a context where voice was safe. Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch-American psychiatrist who spent his career studying the effects of trauma and published The Body Keeps the Score in 2014, arrived at related conclusions from a very different direction. He found that traumatic experience was encoded not in narrative memory, but in somatic memory, in the body's patterns of response, in the nervous system's readiness for threat. And he found that approaches which worked with the body and with imagination, with the felt sense, with creative expression, with movement, could reach those encodings in a way that talk therapy alone could not. The imagination is not an escape from reality. Used with care, it is a more direct route to reality than language alone can provide. Let your imagination rest where it wants to rest tonight. There is no direction it is required to go. Chapter 25, Why Some People Stay Fresh. Here is a small observation from clinical practice, offered without drama. The people who stay psychologically fresh, who retain into their 7th and 8th decades the quality of genuine aliveness that we are trying to describe, almost never achieve this through a program. Through a decision to stay young, through a deliberate regimen of self-improvement. They stayed fresh because they had, at some point, stopped treating their own interior as a problem to be solved and started treating it as a territory to be inhabited. This is not a small distinction. The territory of the interior is vast, larger, Jung consistently insisted, than the conscious mind can comprehend. The collective unconscious, in his framework, extends beyond the individual into the shared inheritance of the species, the archetypes that have shaped human experience across every culture and throughout all of recorded history. Every individual psyche is like an island that rises above the surface of the ocean. The visible land is the ego, the conscious self. Below the waterline is the immense depth of the personal unconscious and, deeper still, the collective unconscious, connecting every island to every other. The person who treats their interior as a problem to be solved is, in this image, someone who spends their life landscaping the visible island while refusing to dive. They can make the surface very pleasant. They cannot change the depth. And the depth is always pressing upward, in dreams, in moods, in the physical symptoms that accumulate when the interior is persistently ignored. The person who inhabits the territory, who dives, however tentatively, and comes back changed, and dives again, that person does not achieve a finished self. They achieve something better. A self in continuous relationship with its own unfinished nature. And that relationship is, in the most practical sense, what keeps them fresh. Not because they are especially virtuous or especially wise, because they are still in motion. You are halfway through the 5 reasons. The deepest material is ahead. Let your body be where it is. Let the night continue at its own pace. Chapter 26. The soul needs surprise. There is a quality of experience that healthy psyches seem to require in the way bodies require certain nutrients. Jung identified it as numinosity, a term borrowed from the religious studies scholar Rudolf Otto, who used it in his 1917 work Das Heilig to describe the particular quality of the encounter with what is sacred. The tremor, the awe, the sense of something that exceeds the category you brought to meet it. Jung secularized the term without domesticating it. He used it to describe any experience in which the ordinary framework of understanding was briefly suspended, in which the world became, for a moment, larger than the map you had of it. We might call it, more simply, surprise. But genuine surprise. Not the social performance of being surprised, not the startled reaction, but the interior experience of encountering something that could not have been predicted from what you already knew. This is rarer in adult life than it was in childhood, for obvious reasons. Children are continually surprised because they know so little. Each new encounter brings the possibility of genuine novelty. Adults have seen more, and the frameworks for understanding new experience have become more robust, which means they also filter more aggressively. The unknown gets processed through the known before it has a chance to remain unknown. But genuine surprise still happens. And the people who stay psychologically fresh are the people who have kept enough of themselves available to be genuinely surprised by a book, by a person, by a landscape, by a piece of music, by a thought they have not had before. The soul, Jung's word, used in his own technical sense, close to the German seal, the interior life as a whole requires this nourishment. When it is absent for too long, the psyche compensates by manufacturing pseudo-surprise, outrage, gossip, scandal, the perpetual novelty without depth of an information cycle that is designed to appear surprising while confirming everything you already believe. The manufactured surprise exhausts without nourishing. The genuine surprise changes something. Notice if there is anything in this room, in this moment, that you have not fully attended to. A sound that is neither loud enough to demand attention, nor quiet enough to have disappeared entirely. The particular temperature of the air. The smell of the room, if there is a smell. Just that. Just noticing. Chapter 27. Boredom comes from repetition. Boredom is not a minor inconvenience. In Jung's clinical reading, and in the reading of subsequent psychologists who have taken this question seriously, boredom is a diagnostic signal. It tells you something about the relationship between the conscious self and the deeper layers of the psyche. The psychologist Adam Phillips, a British psychoanalyst who has written with unusual precision about the subject, argues in his essay on boredom that the bored person is not experiencing an absence of stimulation. They are experiencing an absence of desire. Something in them wants something, but the wanting has been blocked at the level of consciousness. The boredom is the surface manifestation of a deeper restlessness that cannot yet articulate itself. This connects directly to what Jung observed. The psyche generates energy, what he called libido, in a broader sense than Freud used the term. Not specifically sexual energy, but psychic energy in general. The vitality that powers engagement with life. When the conscious self has closed off too many avenues, when the persona is too rigid, when the shadow is too suppressed, when the undeveloped functions are too compressed, the psychic energy has nowhere to go. It pools, it backs up, it creates the sensation of paralysis, of wanting without knowing what you want. The bored person is not bored because nothing is happening. The bored person is bored because something is happening that they cannot feel. The repetition that produces boredom is not necessarily the repetition of events. It is the repetition of the self's relationship to events. The same interpretive templates, the same emotional responses, the same predictable reactions applied to each new experience until the experience is no longer new, no matter how novel it might be in external reality. The antidote, as we have been exploring through play and creativity and wonder, is the cultivation of new relationships to experience, not necessarily new experiences. A person can be renewed by revisiting something familiar with genuinely open attention. A walk they have taken many times, taken this once as if for the first time. A piece of music heard again after years, heard now from the person they have become. Repetition produces boredom. Attention dissolves it. Let your mind be wherever it is. If it is already drifting, that is fine. The ideas continue beneath the drifting. Chapter 28. The fourth real reason. We come now to the fourth reason, and it is the one that, at first, seems most paradoxical. The fourth reason some minds stay young is this: suffering has deepened them without hardening them. Most people expect the opposite. They expect that suffering hardens, that loss and difficulty and disappointment accumulate in the psyche the way scar tissue accumulates in the body. Protective, thickened, less sensitive than what was there before. And sometimes that is what happens. Sometimes the scar tissue is all that remains, but not always. There is a quality of suffering, and it is not the severity of the suffering that determines it, but the relationship in which it is held that does something other than harden. It deepens. It creates in the psyche a kind of additional room that was not there before. a capacity for registering the weight of things that could not have been registered without having first been touched by the weight oneself. The psychologist Paul Tournier, a Swiss physician and writer who worked in the 20th century and whose work overlapped in interesting ways with Jung's, wrote extensively about what he called the creative use of suffering. He observed across decades of clinical practice that the people who emerged from significant loss or difficulty with their vitality intact were not people who had been spared from feeling what had happened to them. They were, consistently, the ones who had allowed themselves to feel it fully. The person who feels loss fully undergoes something. The person who manages loss, who keeps it at arm's length through busyness or rationalization or premature resolution, stores it. And stored grief does not disappear. It waits. Jung's understanding of this was structural. The suffering that is felt, that is genuinely metabolized by the psyche, becomes part of the interior in a way that expands rather than contracts it. The suffering that is avoided becomes a shadow component, part of the territory of the unconscious that cannot be visited without triggering what was deposited there. The fourth reason is not that suffering is good. It is that the capacity to receive suffering without fleeing from it is one of the things that keeps the deeper layers of the psyche alive. Breathe. Let your body feel the weight of the night, which is the weight of being alive and at rest. We continue. Chapter 29. Suffering deepens without hardening. Viktor Frankl was a Viennese psychiatrist who spent 3 years in the concentration camps of Auschwitz, Dachau, and 2 other camps during the Second World War. He lost his wife, his parents, and his brother in the camps. He lost the manuscript of a book he had been writing for years, hidden in the lining of a coat that was taken from him on arrival. He survived. And the book he wrote afterward, Man's Search for Meaning, published in German in 1946, was based on what he had observed in the camps about the difference between those who survived psychologically and those who did not. He was careful not to moralize. He was very clear that survival was not a function of virtue, that physical condition, random chance, and factors entirely outside any person's control played decisive roles. But he observed something about psychological survival, about the maintenance of the interior even when everything exterior had been stripped away, that seemed to him significant. The people who maintained their humanity in the camps, who continued to be capable of compassion and humor and the occasional glimpse of beauty in a sunset over the mountains, were not people who had been spared suffering. They had suffered identically. They were people who had found a relationship to their suffering that did not let it become the totality of their experience. Frankl's formulation of this was spare and precise. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves, not to reframe the situation, not to find a silver lining, to change the relationship between the interior and what the exterior has imposed. That change, the change of relationship rather than circumstance, is what he observed, producing what he called the defiant power of the human spirit. Not defiance in the aggressive sense, in the sense of maintaining something, some ground, some center, some basic orientation toward what was still possible, even within the worst that human beings have done to each other. This is suffering that deepens without hardening. The depth is real, the cost is real, and the interior that results is larger than the one that existed before, because it has been opened by what it went through. Let the quiet of this room be what it is. The quiet is not empty. It is full of the particular history of this night. Rest in it. Chapter 30. Pain can mature the heart. The distinction between hardening and deepening, between the scar tissue that contracts and the wound that creates new capacity, is not always visible from outside. It is not always visible from inside for some time. The person who has hardened from suffering is often described as strong. They do not appear fragile. They are reliable, efficient, apparently unmoved. They have learned through pain not to invest too heavily, not to hope too openly, not to love without reserves, not to extend themselves past the point where withdrawal becomes difficult. They are, in a certain sense, very safe, and they are, in the same sense, very enclosed. The person who has deepened from suffering often appears more fragile, at least initially, than the person who has hardened. They are more easily moved. They are more readily touched by the suffering of others because their own suffering did not teach them to avoid contact with pain. It taught them what pain is actually like from the inside, which makes the pain of others more legible, not less. Irvin Yalom, the American existential psychiatrist who spent his career at Stanford and wrote both clinical texts and novels about the work of therapy, observed in his clinical practice that the most effective therapists were, without exception, people who had been through something difficult and had emerged changed. Not despite their own wounding, but in some sense because of it. The wound had given them access to a room in human experience that purely protected people could not enter. He was careful to note that difficulty alone did not produce this. The psychologist who had been through difficulty and had processed it well, who had allowed it to do its metabolic work in the psyche, had become something different from the psychologist who had been through difficulty and had armored against it. The matured heart is the heart that has been broken and has found, not that the breaking can be undone, but that the broken place has become a place of greater permeability, of greater capacity for contact. Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese-American poet who published The Prophet in 1923, wrote something adjacent to this that has circulated widely enough that you have probably encountered it. That the depth of the cup that holds your joy is determined by the depth of the sorrow that carved it. He was not being sentimental. He was making an observation about psychological capacity, that the person who has allowed themselves to feel sorrow fully has created room for joy, that the person who has avoided sorrow cannot access. Let your body sink. You do not need to hold anything up tonight. Chapter 31. Trauma does not decide everything. A necessary clarification. Nothing that has been said about suffering is an argument that suffering is good. It is not. Loss is not secretly valuable. Abuse is not secretly instructive. The damage that one person does to another is real damage, and the framing of that damage as a growth opportunity is, in most cases, an additional violence committed against the person who was already harmed. Bessel van der Kolk spent his career demonstrating with clinical precision the mechanisms by which traumatic experience reshapes the nervous system, how early or overwhelming trauma alters the basic operations of perception, memory, and relationship in ways that are not merely psychological but neurological. The body keeps the score. The evidence of what happened is written in muscle tension, in startle response, in the particular patterns of reactivity that form around injuries to the sense of safety. This is real. This is not disputable. And yet, his clinical work also demonstrated something equally important, that the nervous system, even significantly altered by trauma, retains plasticity. It retains the capacity to revise. Not through willpower, not through understanding alone, through new experience, specifically through experiences of safety that are genuine enough and sustained enough to allow the nervous system to update its model of what the world is like. The body that learned to brace can learn to release. The mind that learned that people are dangerous can learn. Slowly, incompletely, not without setbacks, that some people are not. Jung's framework accommodates this. He was not naive about the damage that early experience could do, or about the weight of complexes, emotionally charged psychological patterns formed around painful experiences that could distort the personality for decades. But he was equally clear that the complexes were not the totality of the psyche, that the self, the deeper organizing principle of the personality, continued to generate toward wholeness even when significant parts of the conscious life were organized around wound. Trauma does not decide everything. It shapes significantly. And in that shaping, there is often room, created precisely by what was done to the person, for kinds of depth and compassion and understanding that would not have been possible without it. This is not consolation. It is an observation about what the psyche is capable of. Let your breath move at its own pace, slow or fast, shallow or deep. It knows what it needs. Chapter 32. The Wound That Teaches Tenderness. In a workshop in Japan, sometime in the 16th century, a potter was firing bowls. One of the bowls cracked in the kiln. The impulse in any other tradition would have been to discard it. Instead, the bowl was repaired. The cracks were filled with lacquer mixed with gold, silver, or platinum powder. The repaired bowl was placed beside unrepaired bowls. It was not hidden. It was displayed. The aesthetic practice is called kintsugi, sometimes translated as golden joinery. The philosophical principle behind it holds that breakage and repair are part of the history of an object, and that this history is worth making visible rather than disguising. The repaired bowl is not pretending to be unbroken. It is demonstrating that it has been broken and survived, and that the survival has made it more interesting rather than less. The application to human experience is not a metaphor Jung would have needed to explain to his clinical audience. He worked with people who were trying to pretend they had not cracked, who maintained a surface of completeness while the fractures ran beneath. And his consistent clinical finding was that the pretense was more damaging than the crack. The effort of maintaining the appearance of being unbroken was consuming energy that the healing required. The person who has been genuinely hurt and has genuinely recovered, who has held the hurt in view, who has found the words or the images or the physical practices that allowed the wound to be metabolized, carries something different from the person who has not been hurt or the person who has been hurt and has armored around it. They carry an understanding of what it is like to be inside a broken thing and still be whole. This understanding is extraordinarily difficult to fake and extraordinarily useful when encountering another person in the same position. It is the understanding that makes tenderness possible, not pity. Pity looks down at suffering from the position of the one who has been spared it. Tenderness is lateral. It looks across. It recognizes. The tendon person knows what the broken bowl knows, that the gold in the cracks is real, and that what was once a flaw has become the most beautiful and telling part of the whole. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. Let the body do its work of resting. Chapter 33. Bitterness ages the psyche. Of all the things that age the psyche prematurely, bitterness is among the most reliable. Bitterness is not the same as anger. Anger is immediate, responsive, mobile. Anger has an object, a direction, an energy that can be discharged or redirected or channeled into something constructive. Anger passes through the psyche the way a storm passes through a landscape, intensely, with damage possible, but also with the possibility of clearing. Bitterness has no such mobility. Bitterness is the settling of anger that was never discharged, anger that was legitimate, that had a real object, that deserved to be felt and expressed and resolved, but was not. And then, over time, the undischarged anger loses its specific object, but retains its charge. The person is no longer angry at the specific person or situation that wronged them. They are angry at everything, with a generalized acidity that flavors every encounter and every assessment. The bitter person is not wrong about having been wronged. That is the particular difficulty of bitterness. The injury that produced it was usually real. The grievance was legitimate. The world did not deliver what it promised, or a person did not do what they should have done, or something was taken that should not have been taken. These are real injuries, not imagined ones. What bitterness does with these real injuries is freeze them. It keeps them alive, vivid, fully accessible, as emotionally present as the day they happened, while preventing the growth that genuine mourning makes possible. The bitter person has not moved past the injury. They live in it. They have made their residence there. And the cost, in Jung's understanding, is the cost of that frozen residence. The psyche consumes enormous energy maintaining the frozen state. The creative function, the generative, forward-looking, symbol-making capacity of the unconscious is impeded. The person becomes oriented backward, toward the wrong done, rather than forward, toward what might still be made. The philosopher Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, called this resentment, using the French term ressentiment to capture a particular quality he found in certain moral systems. The inversion of creative energy into reactive energy. The transformation of the impulse to build into the impulse to condemn. He was not unsympathetic to the person who felt this. He understood what produced it. He was simply clear that it was antithetical to life, that it turned the organism against itself. Feel the weight of your body again, just its weight, not its history, just its present weight, here, tonight. Chapter 34, Forgiveness Restores Movement. Forgiveness is a word that has accumulated so many associations, religious, therapeutic, sentimentalized, coerced, that it is nearly impossible to use without triggering one of them. So let us be very specific about what we mean. We do not mean the exoneration of what was done. The real injuries remain real. We do not mean the reconciliation with the person who did the injuring. Sometimes that is impossible. Sometimes it would not be safe. We do not mean the erasure of the wound. The wound is real and it carries what it carries. We mean something narrower and more interior. The decision to stop allowing the injury to be the organizing principle of the psyche. This is not a single moment. It is a process, and it is a long one, and it very often does not proceed in a straight line. And it is not primarily a moral act. It is not done for the sake of the person who caused the harm. It is done because the alternative, the continued frozen residence in the injury, is consuming more of the interior than the person has to spare. The psychotherapist and Jungian analyst Thomas More, who wrote extensively about the soul and its care, described forgiveness in his work as a recovery of the future. The bitter person has surrendered their future to the past. The person who forgives, in this precise, limited, interior sense, reclaims it. Not perfectly, not without backsliding, but directionally. Jung was careful not to prescribe forgiveness as a therapeutic technique. He was too careful a clinician to tell people what they should feel, but he consistently observed that the patients who found their way to genuine psychological freedom had, in almost every case, found a way to loosen the grip of the past on the present, not to deny the past, not to diminish it, to stop being imprisoned in it. The moment that grip loosens, the psyche begins to move again. The generative function resumes. The creative energy, which had been locked in the maintenance of resentment, becomes available for other purposes. Movement is youth. The psyche in motion does not grow old. Let your hands rest where they are. Let your face soften. We come now to the fifth reason, the one that asks the most, the one that, in the end, holds all the others. Chapter 35, The Fifth Real Reason. The fifth reason some minds do not grow old, and the deepest one, the one that the first four have been preparing us for, is this: they keep becoming themselves. Not becoming who they think they should be. Not becoming what the world needs them to be. not completing the project of the self, arriving at the finished version, and then defending that version against all incoming revision. They keep becoming. Present tense, ongoing. As if the self were not a destination but a process, something happening in real time, something that is never quite finished, something that retains to the last, in some essential way, the character of beginning. Carl Jung called this process individuation. He first articulated it clearly in 2 essays on analytical psychology, published in German in 1916 and 1917, and he returned to it in different forms throughout the remaining 4 decades of his career. It was in many ways his central contribution to psychology, not the collective unconscious, not the archetypes, not the theory of psychological types, though all of those matter. The central contribution was the idea that the human psyche had a teleology, a direction, a tendency towards something, and that this direction was toward wholeness, not perfection, wholeness. The integration of what had been split off, the recovery of what had been denied, the ongoing enlargement of what the conscious self was capable of containing. Individuation is not a program. It is not a set of exercises or a therapeutic technique or a lifestyle. It is what happens when a person stops fighting the psyche's own direction and begins to cooperate with it. And it never finishes. This is the key point for tonight. Jung, at 83, sitting in that garden in Kusnacht, with his large, still hands on his knees and his open, receiving eyes, was still individuating, still becoming. The process does not arrive at completion before death. It arrives at death, which is a different thing. The mind that has understood this, not intellectually, but in the bones, in the way that understanding settles when it has been genuinely earned, is not afraid of incompleteness in the same way. The unfinished self is not a failure. It is the evidence of ongoing life. Breathe. We are beginning the longest exploration of the night. Follow it at whatever pace you need. Chapter 36. You keep becoming yourself. There is a moment that many people describe at various points in adult life that goes like this. They catch themselves in the middle of something, a conversation, a routine task, a moment of entirely ordinary experience, and for a few seconds they have the strange sensation that they do not know who is doing this. The familiar scripts have gone briefly quiet. The person who usually runs things has stepped out of the frame for a moment, and in their absence, something else, something quieter and less defined, is briefly visible. Most people find this experience mildly alarming and quickly restore the ordinary scripts. The ego, which is very good at its job, returns and takes up its role, and the moment closes. But Jung considered those moments of particular interest. Not because they were mystical. He was a scientist, and his psychology was empirical, built from decades of clinical observation. But because those moments revealed the gap between the ego and the self, between the personality as currently constituted and the fuller personality that the individuation process was, always and continuously working to actualize. The self, in Jung's technical usage, was not the ego's opposite. It was the ego's container, the organizing principle of the whole personality, conscious and unconscious together, rather than just its surface. The self knew things that the ego did not. It had access to material, particularly in the form of dreams and involuntary images, and the particular emotional charges that attach to certain people and places and experiences that the ego had not yet processed. And it was always working toward something, not a fixed goal. The self is not teleological in the way that a business plan is teleological. More like a seed that knows what it is growing toward without being able to say what the plant will look like in full growth. It moves toward the fullest possible expression of what this particular person is capable of being. The person who cooperates with this process keeps becoming. The person who resists it, who has decided what they are and must remain what they have decided, stops. And the psyche's energy, denied the direction of individuation, goes elsewhere, into symptoms, into projection, into the compulsive repetitions that accumulate around the unacknowledged. You keep becoming yourself, or you stop. And stopping in the psyche is not rest. It is a different kind of motion entirely. Chapter 37. Individuation never finishes. The word individuation comes from the Latin individuum, meaning that which cannot be divided further. The individual, the specific, irreducible particular, and individuation, as Jung used it, means the process of becoming that particular, the process of becoming fully and in all its complexity the specific person that you actually are, not the person your parents needed you to be, not the person your culture rewarded, not the person your wounds taught you to become in order to be safe. The person underneath and behind all of those adaptations, the one who has always been there, partially expressed, partially suppressed, waiting for more of itself to be brought forward. This process, Jung consistently argued, was lifelong. Not because the psyche is inefficient, but because the particular you are becoming is not a fixed thing. It grows as you grow. The person you are at 50 has possibilities that the person at 20 could not have imagined, because suffering and loss and the passage of time have created new interior territory. The person at 70 has possibilities that the person at 50 could not have imagined for the same reason. The horizon of individuation does not get closer as you approach it. It expands. This is not a consolation for being unfinished. It is the structure of what it means to be alive. The finished self is a dead self, not metaphorically, but in the sense that the psyche's generative function has ceased. The living self is always in some degree of becoming. Hermann Hesse, the German-Swiss writer who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1946, and who was himself in Jungian analysis with Joseph Lang, a pupil of Jung's, wrote about individuation throughout his fiction without ever using the word. Siddhartha, published in 1922, traced a life of becoming, a series of stages, each of which was necessary and each of which had to be surrendered when its lesson was complete. The stage that had to be surrendered most completely was the one where the seeker believed they had arrived. That stage, the belief that the work is done, that the self is complete, that no further revision is possible or necessary, is, in Hesse's telling, the most dangerous. Not because the self at that moment is wrong, but because the belief of completion is the thing that stops the process that produces genuine life. Individuation never finishes, and in that unfinishedness is its gift. Let your mind be wherever it is. Drifting or present, both are fine. The ideas continue beneath you. Chapter 38. The self stays in motion. There is a quality of stillness that is not the opposite of motion, but its deepest form. The lake in winter, when the surface ice is perfectly still, is still in motion, the water moving beneath, the slow circulation of temperature and mineral and life that the frozen surface does not reveal. The motion is not visible, but its absence would mean the death of what the lake is. The self, in Jung's psychology, has this quality of deep motion. In periods of apparent outer stillness, in illness, in retirement, in the long seasons of withdrawal that sometimes come without invitation, the interior is not stagnant, it is circulating. Material is moving from one level to another. What was unconscious is approaching consciousness. What was too bright to look at directly is becoming, with time, possible to approach. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote about this in her work on alchemy, drawing on Jung's extensive engagement with the alchemical tradition. The alchemists, she observed, understood that the transformation they sought could not be forced. It required containment, the sealed vessel, the temenos, the protected space in which the process could proceed without interference, and it required time, more time than the impatient ego, which wanted results, was willing to allow. The practical implication for a psychology of aging is this: the apparent stillness of the second half of life is often the appearance of a process, not its absence. The person who has surrendered the busyness of early adulthood, who has fewer external obligations and a slower pace, is not necessarily stagnating. They may be doing the most significant interior work of their life in the stillness that only became available when the earlier noise receded. William Blake, the English poet and visionary who lived from 1757 to 1827 and produced his most important work in states of intense inner activity that his contemporaries often misunderstood, wrote that energy is eternal delight. He was not describing the frantic energy of the anxious ego. He was describing the deep, patient motion of the self. The self stays in motion. Even when the surface is still, even when nothing visible is happening, even in this room, at this hour, in the silence of the night. It is happening now. Chapter 39. Why Stagnation Feels Old. A question worth sitting with. Have you ever been in the company of someone who seemed old, not in age, but in essence? Who had a quality of being finished, of having already decided, finally and irreversibly, how everything was and would remain? It is not always an elderly person. It can be someone in their 30s who has arrived at a set of conclusions about the world and about themselves and has built a wall around those conclusions, who speaks with absolute certainty about things that are genuinely uncertain, who responds to new information not with interest but with the immediate work of accommodation, finding the interpretation that allows the new information to confirm what was already believed. And you may have been in the company of someone who seemed young, not in age, but in essence, who retained at 70 or 80 the quality of genuine encounter with the world, who could be surprised, who changed their mind visibly in front of you when evidence required it, who could not be easily categorized, whose interior was clearly larger than any single description of them could contain. Jung's framework gives a name to the difference. The first person is identified with the ego and with the ego's project of maintaining its own consistency. The second person has access to the self, to the deeper process of individuation, which uses new experience as material for growth rather than fuel for the confirmation of existing categories. Stagnation is not rest. This is a point worth being clear about. Rest is the body and the conscious mind laying down their burdens temporarily in order to continue the work. Stagnation is a decision, almost never a conscious one, that the work is finished, that nothing new will be asked of the interior, that the current version of the self is the final version. The stagnant psyche does not rest. It decays. The energy that was previously channeled into growth and encounter and genuine engagement turns inward and becomes recursive, the same thoughts circling, the same complaints rehearsed, the same certainties polished until they shine with an appearance of wisdom that is underneath the sheen of something that has stopped moving. Stagnation feels old because it is old, in the specific sense that the past has become dominant over the present and the future has become a projection of the past rather than an open territory. Feel the air in the room. Notice that it is real, that this moment is happening, not the past moment, not the future one, this one. It is already new. Chapter 40. Overthinking without growth. There is a particular form of mental activity that mimics growth while preventing it. It is common, it is exhausting, and it is, in Jung's clinical observation, one of the primary obstacles to individuation in intelligent people. He called it ruminative thinking. We might call it overthinking. The mind that reviews the same territory continuously, the same events, the same grievances, the same self-criticisms, the same unanswerable questions, under the impression that continued review will eventually produce resolution. It will not this way. The problem is not the thinking itself. Thinking about difficult things is not pathological. The problem is the quality of the thinking, the fact that it is circular rather than progressive. It revisits rather than advances. It produces a sensation of activity, of being engaged with important material while actually maintaining the material in its current form rather than metabolizing it. Ethan Kross, the American psychologist, whose research on self-talk has been published in books including Chatter, has documented the mechanism by which rumination intensifies emotional experience rather than processing it. When we replay difficult events from the close, immersive first-person perspective, we re-experience the emotional charge without the distance that allows processing. The result is not insight. It is increased distress. His research and the related work of the psychologists Ethan Kross and Özlem Ayduk suggests that a small linguistic shift changes this dynamic significantly. Referring to yourself by name when conducting inner dialogue, addressing yourself as you would address another person, creates enough psychological distance to allow the executive function to re-engage with what was being experienced too closely. This connects to Jung's broader observation that the material the psyche needs to work with cannot be processed from inside it. It requires some form of externalization through image, through language, through a dialogue with another person, or with the interior through active imagination. That creates the distance necessary for genuine examination. Overthinking without growth is thinking that stays inside the thought that goes somewhere, that changes something, always does it through a door, to another person, to a page, to an image, to a form of expression that lets the interior become visible and therefore revisable. If your mind is circling something tonight, just notice that it is circling. You do not need to stop it. You do not need to solve it. Just let it circle in the background while the rest of you rests. Chapter 41. The inner critic hates renewal. There is a voice. You know it. It narrates your failures with a specificity that is genuinely impressive. It remembers the thing you said in 2009 that you would prefer not to think about. It assesses your performance against a standard that it has never quite made explicit, but that is somehow always just above your current level. It is, at its most active, the loudest thing in the room. Jung called this the inner critic, the shadow in its negative mode, not the shadow in the full sense, which contains both positive and negative rejected material, but the specific form it takes when the self-judging function becomes too dominant. He also saw it as a manifestation of what he called the negative animus or negative anima, depending on the psychological configuration. The internal figure that systematically devalues the self's creative attempts. The inner critic hates renewal for a structural reason. Renewal requires the risk of failure, and the inner critic's primary function is the preemptive management of failure. If you never attempt what you might fail at, you cannot fail. If you do not begin the creative project, the painting, the difficult conversation, the new beginning, you cannot be told that you did it wrong. It is, from a certain angle, protective. It developed because something in early experience suggested that failure had consequences that were not survivable, not physically, but psychologically. The person who was shamed for their mistakes in childhood, the person who learned that love was conditional on performance, the person who discovered that being wrong was dangerous in their household, those people developed very effective inner critics. The inner critic was a solution to a real problem. The problem is that the solution has outlasted the problem. The inner critic that was necessary at 7 is still active at 50, still running the same protective program in conditions that no longer require it. And in its protection, it is preventing precisely the kind of renewal that the individuating psyche is trying to generate. The response to the inner critic, Jung's response, and the response of most analysts who have worked with this material, is not to argue with it or silence it. It is to put it in its place, to acknowledge what it is trying to protect, and then, gently, to proceed anyway. The person whose mind stays young has learned to hear the inner critic and continue. This is not recklessness. It is the specific courage that renewal requires. Nothing you have done or not done disqualifies you from what this night is offering. Chapter 42. Complexes resist new life. The word complex in everyday usage means complicated. In Jungian psychology, it means something more specific and more interesting. A complex is a cluster of emotional associations, memories, fantasies, beliefs, physical sensations, organized around a charged central image or experience. Everyone has them. They are not pathological in themselves. They are structures of the psyche that form around emotionally significant experiences, and they organize the person's response to situations that echo those experiences. The mother complex, to take Jung's most famous example, is not simply a person's relationship with their actual mother. It is an entire structural pattern of the psyche that shapes how the person relates to nurturing, to authority, to vulnerability, to the need for care. It is formed in the earliest experiences of being held or not held, seen or not seen, and it continues to exert its influence in adult relationships that have nothing obvious to do with the literal mother. Complexes, once formed, have a quality of autonomy. They behave, Jung observed, as if they have a will of their own. When a complex is activated by a situation that echoes its central experience, it can temporarily take over the conscious personality. The person finds themselves reacting not to what is actually happening, but to what the complex recognizes as similar to what happened before. They are, briefly, not themselves. They are the complex. This is common. The person who becomes inexplicably furious when corrected in public because the complex around humiliation is activated. The person who becomes a child again in the presence of a disapproving authority figure because the complex around early judgment is activated. The person who sabotages relationships at a certain point of closeness, because the complex around abandonment is activated. Complexes resist new life in a specific way. They apply old solutions to new situations. The complex does not update. It is not a learning system. It replays its response to the central wound whenever it detects what it reads as the relevant trigger. The individuating person is the person who gradually, never completely, never without relapse, develops enough awareness of their complexes that the complex's autonomy is reduced, not eliminated. Reduced. The person learns to recognize the characteristic sensation that accompanies complex activation and, in that recognition, creates a moment of choice that did not previously exist. That moment of choice is where new life becomes possible. Let your muscles soften wherever they have tightened. The body holds the complexes too. In its own way, in the dark, it is loosening them. Chapter 43, Childhood is Not Lost. There is a room in the house of the psyche that most adults have locked. They have the key somewhere, in a memory, in a dream, in the particular quality of attention they give to certain kinds of music, or light, or smell. But the door is kept closed, and the explanation for keeping it closed shifts over the years. First, it is because adults do not behave that way. Then, because there is no time. Then, because what is in that room, the innocence, the directness, the uncomplicated capacity for delight and for grief, belongs to a self that no longer exists, but it does still exist. This is one of the findings that Jung returned to most consistently across his career and across the case histories that populated his clinical writing. The childhood self does not disappear when the adult self takes over. It goes underground. It lives in the deeper layers of the psyche, carrying the capacities it developed before the adaptations of adolescence and adulthood covered them over. The capacity for genuine wonder is there. The capacity for direct feeling. Grief that is fully grief. Joy that is fully joy. Without the managing overlay of adult composure is there. The capacity for play without justification is there. The capacity for questions that do not yet have the form of acceptable questions, the child's why, asked without embarrassment, asked past the point where adults stop asking, is there. Jung's encounter with these interior figures, the child figures that appeared in his own dreams and in the dreams of his patients, consistently revealed them to be resources, not liabilities. Not the wounded child of contemporary therapeutic language, though that exists too and requires attention, but the creative child, the part of the psyche that has not yet decided what it is, and is therefore still capable of being everything. The Jesuit priest and psychologist Anthony de Mello, who worked in India and taught widely before his death in 1987, told a story about a visitor who comes to a wise man and says, "I feel that my life is empty. I have accomplished much. I have position, comfort, security, and yet I feel nothing." The wise man says, "You have built a very fine house. You have forgotten to put anyone in it." The child is the one who was forgotten in the house. Childhood is not lost, it is waiting. Feel that possibility, if you can, not as nostalgia, as something present. Chapter 44. The unconscious loves renewal. We said earlier that the unconscious does not age the way the ego does. Now we can be more specific about what we mean. The unconscious, in Jung's understanding of it, is not a static repository. It is a generative field. It produces material continuously, dreams, images, emotional charges, involuntary associations, the particular way certain music moves you, the way certain faces hold your attention longer than others. the recurring figure in the dream you have had for 30 years. This generation is not random. It follows the principle of compensation. The unconscious tends to produce what the conscious mind has omitted, overlooked, suppressed, or denied. If the conscious personality is rigidly intellectual, the unconscious produces feeling images of unusual intensity. If the conscious personality has become hard, the unconscious produces dreams of tenderness. If the conscious personality is optimistic to a fault, the unconscious produces images that acknowledge the shadow. This is not punishment, it is balance. The psyche is always working toward a state of greater wholeness, and it uses the unconscious as its primary instrument for generating the material that wholeness requires. The word renewal is exactly right for this process, because renewal implies not the creation of something entirely new, but the restoration of something to a living state that it had temporarily lost. The farmer renews the soil not by replacing it, but by returning to it what has been taken, the organic matter, the minerals, the conditions under which it can again be generative. The unconscious renews the psyche by returning to it what it has given away in the process of becoming an adult. The wonder that was sacrificed on the altar of competence. The playfulness that was surrendered in the acquisition of seriousness. The feeling function that was suppressed in the cultivation of professional efficiency. The child that was locked in the room. These things are not gone. They are in the unconscious, still generative, still pressing toward expression. Every dream in which they appear is the unconscious's attempt to renew the conscious personality from the inside. The person who maintains a genuine relationship with their unconscious through dreams, through creative activity, through active imagination, through the willingness to be moved by what moves them, is the person who remains in contact with the psyche's renewable energy. And in contact with that energy, the mind does not grow old. We are in the final third of tonight's exploration. The ideas are settling like sediment in water, settling but not disappearing, becoming part of what is here. Chapter 45. Meaning makes the mind young. Viktor Frankl observed something in the concentration camps that he spent the rest of his life trying to articulate. Meaning is not a luxury. It is a necessity. The human organism, the whole organism, not just the conscious mind, requires it in the way it requires food and water. Without it, something in the person begins to fail. He was precise about what he meant by meaning. He did not mean happiness. He did not mean comfort or pleasure or the absence of suffering. He meant the experience of one's life as coherent, as pointing toward something, as mattering in some way that extended beyond the mere fact of biological survival. He found that people who retained this experience, even in conditions that had stripped away every external source of it, retained something else along with it. A quality of aliveness that the people who had lost it did not have. They were not happier in any ordinary sense. They were not safer or more comfortable. but they were alive in a fuller way. Jung's contribution to this observation comes through the concept of the self as organizer of meaning. The individuating psyche is always engaged in a project, always oriented towards something, even if that something cannot be fully articulated. The person who cooperates with this process experiences their life as meaningful even when its contents are difficult. The person who has stopped cooperating, who has no sense of movement, no orientation toward growth, no relationship with the deeper layers of the psyche, often reports a sense of meaninglessness that is independent of outer circumstance. The mind that is engaged in a meaningful project does not grow old in the same way. Not because meaning erases difficulty, it does not, but because the engagement with meaning is itself a form of the psychological vitality we have been describing all night. It is the self in relationship with something larger than itself. It is the organism oriented toward its own fullest expression. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius in the 1st century of the Common Era, from a position of enormous wealth and power and deep philosophical doubt, said something that translates roughly as this: "The person who is everywhere is nowhere." He was speaking of the scattered life, the life of busyness without direction. The person who has found something that organizes their attention, that gives the day a shape and the hour a weight, is the person who is somewhere. And being somewhere, genuinely, is the beginning of meaning. The mind in the service of meaning stays alert, stays interested, stays, in the most important sense, young. Let your body settle deeper. Let the meaning of this quiet moment be enough for now. Chapter 46. Loneliness and Inner Ripening. There is a form of solitude that is not loneliness, though it uses the same outer conditions. And there is a form of loneliness that can be, with time and care, transmuted into something more like the first thing. The distinction matters because loneliness, in its acute form, the form that arrives at 2 a.m. with the quality of a physical weight on the chest, is not simply the absence of other people. It is the experience of being unknown, of being in the world without being seen by it, of carrying an interior that has no adequate witness. Most adults carry more of this than they can account for. The relationships that surround them are real relationships, with genuine care and genuine history. But the particular interior, the private version of the self, the one that knows things about itself that it has never found a way to say, often goes unwitnessed for years, sometimes for decades. Jung was not naive about this. He wrote in his autobiographical reflections that he had spent much of his life feeling fundamentally alone, not despite the relationships and the clinical work and the large public career, but alongside them. The interior he had was not one that most of the people around him were equipped to receive. This is not a complaint in his writing, it is an observation. And what he made of it was significant. The aloneness became the condition in which the inner work was possible. The solitude that had no adequate human witness found its witness in the unconscious itself, in the figures and images and dreams that populated the Red Book period and the decades of clinical reflection that followed. The inner ripening that occurs in solitude, in genuine inhabited solitude, not the passive isolation of disconnection, is the process by which the unwitnessed self begins to witness itself, to become, in the careful and patient way that all deep things become known to itself. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in his Letters to a Young Poet written between 1902 and 1908, advised the young poet Franz Xaver Capus to love his solitude and bear with beautiful lamentation the suffering it occasioned. He was not recommending suffering. He was recommending the inhabitation of what was real, the full presence in the difficult experience rather than the flight from it. The ripened interior is the interior that has been present in its own aloneness long enough to find what aloneness has to offer, and what it has to offer is substantial. You are in this room alone, or nearly alone, in the dark. That is not nothing. That is the condition of this night. Chapter 47. Why Some Souls Stay Curious. We have circled back here at the approach of the final hours to where we began, curiosity. But we are looking at it differently now. We have been through the flexibility of the unconscious, through play and creativity and suffering and individuation. And from this position, curiosity looks different than it did at the beginning. At the beginning, it looked like a trait, something some people have and others do not. A natural disposition, either present from early life or not. Now it looks more like a practice, a choice made daily, sometimes moment by moment, in the face of the ego's persistent preference for confirmation over encounter. The curious soul is not born more curious than others, or not only born that way. They have kept something alive that all souls have access to through the specific discipline, not always recognized as discipline, sometimes experienced as simple pleasure of genuine encounter with what is not yet known. This discipline has different faces. The person who reads widely past the borders of what they already know to be interesting. The person who maintains friendships across significant differences of experience and opinion. The person who continues to ask, in the privacy of their own interior, questions that do not have ready answers. The person who pays attention to what makes them uncomfortable rather than avoiding it, who takes the discomfort as information rather than signal to exit. The Benedictine monk Thomas Merton, who lived from 1915 to 1968 and spent most of his adult life in a monastery in Kentucky, was one of the most curious people of the 20th century, which is remarkable given the constraints of his external life. He was a monk who was also a poet, a social critic, a student of Zen, a lover of jazz, an author of dozens of books, a correspondent with hundreds of people he would never meet. The monastery was not a limitation on his curiosity. It was a stable ground from which his curiosity could range as widely as it needed to. He wrote that the contemplative life, the life of genuine interior attention, was not a narrowing but an expansion. That silence, properly inhabited, made the world larger rather than smaller. That the person who went inward far enough came out the other side into a kind of spaciousness that no amount of external novelty could have provided. The curious soul stays curious because it has found that curiosity is the condition of contact with what is real. And contact with what is real is the only thing that fully satisfies the hunger the soul carries. Feel that hunger, if you can identify it. It is not a painful thing. It is the hunger of something alive. Chapter 48. Mental Health and Psychological Freshness. It would be incomplete to spend this much time discussing what keeps a mind fresh without acknowledging what prevents it, not the dramatic obstacles which we have touched on, but the quieter, more pervasive conditions that make psychological freshness difficult to maintain. Anxiety, in its chronic form, is one of them. Not the existential anxiety that Kierkegaard described, the vertigo of freedom, which is a sign of genuine psychological engagement, the chronic background anxiety that has become the baseline operating condition for a significant portion of contemporary life. The low-level arousal that keeps the nervous system in a slightly elevated state of readiness, not quite fight or flight, but not quite at rest either. This state is incompatible with wonder. The nervous system in low-level threat mode processes information through the lens of potential danger. It is scanning for what might go wrong, rather than genuinely open to what is actually present. The capacity for the kind of encounter we have been describing, the meeting of experience on its own terms, without the template of threat running in the background, requires a nervous system that has found its way to genuine safety. This is not purely a matter of will or practice. It is often a matter of circumstance, of whether the conditions of daily life include enough genuine safety to allow the nervous system to settle. The person in chronic financial stress, the person in an unsafe relationship, the person carrying unprocessed trauma, these people are not failing to be psychologically fresh. They are using their available resources appropriately. But for the person who has the conditions for genuine safety and has not yet found the way to let the nervous system trust them, for the person whose anxiety is disproportionate to actual current threat, the work of individuation includes the work of finding ground. Real, felt ground. The sense of being safe enough, right now, to be genuinely present. Stephen Porges, the American neuroscientist who developed polyvagal theory in the 1990s, describes the state of safety as not merely the absence of danger, but the presence of something, of cues in the environment and in social connection that the nervous system reads as genuinely supportive. Safety is felt, not merely reasoned. The room you are in right now is safe enough for sleep. The body knows this, or is coming to know it. Let that be true. Chapter 49. The Shadow of Cynicism. There is one more obstacle to psychological freshness that deserves its own attention, because it is so often mistaken for wisdom. Cynicism. Cynicism looks like wisdom from the outside. It has the shape of sophistication, the person who has seen enough to no longer be surprised by disappointment, who has stopped being deceived by surface appearances, who maintains the realist's advantage of low expectations. When cynicism speaks, it often sounds authoritative. It has the confidence of someone who has finally seen through the illusions that naive people still depend on. But Jung's clinical observation was direct about what cynicism actually is. It is the disappointed idealist. The cynic is not a person who has transcended the need for meaning and hope. They are a person who once had genuine hope, often very large hope, the hope of someone who cared very much about something and who was disappointed by it badly enough that they concluded the problem was the hoping itself. The conclusion is understandable. The conclusion is wrong. The problem was not the hoping. The problem was, in most cases, an attachment to a particular form of what was hoped for, an investment not just in the value itself, but in the specific expression of it that failed. The person who hoped that a relationship would be permanent and found that it was not sometimes concludes that love is an illusion. The person who worked for an institution that let them down sometimes concludes that institutions always fail the people they claim to serve. The person who trusted someone who betrayed them sometimes concludes that people cannot be trusted. These conclusions feel like clear-sightedness. They are, in fact, the same absolutism as the naive idealism they replaced. They have simply inverted the valence. The mature response to disappointment, not the easy response, but the one that the individuating psyche is capable of, is neither naive idealism nor cynicism. It is what the philosopher Gabriel Marcel called disponibility, a French word that means something like openness or readiness, or the capacity to be present to what is actually here, rather than oriented either toward what might go wrong or toward what cannot be. The open hand that is neither grasping nor defended, the person who can still be surprised, still be moved, still find something genuinely worth caring about, not despite having been disappointed, but having been through enough disappointment to know that it does not finally justify the closure it tempts. That person's mind does not grow old. Chapter 50. When knowledge becomes dead weight. There is a particular burden that intelligence carries. The more you know, the more you have to carry. A knowledge that is carried rather than inhabited, held as a possession rather than used as a living instrument, eventually becomes weight rather than resource. The philosopher Simone Weil, who lived from 1909 to 1943, and who combined a remarkable intellectual rigor with a deep capacity for practical engagement with suffering, wrote about what she called decreation, a word she used to describe the necessary emptying of the self before genuine attention was possible. She meant that the full self, the self laden with opinions, with prior conclusions, with the accumulated certainties of experience and education, was too full to genuinely receive what was in front of it. Something had to be laid down before genuine seeing could occur. This is very close to what Thich Nhat Hanh meant by beginner's mind, and to what Jung meant by the suspension of the known attitude. The person who has learned a great deal must, if they want to continue growing, periodically return to a condition of not knowing. Not the not knowing of ignorance, which is simply the absence of learning, but the not knowing of the student who has learned enough to know how much they have not yet understood. T.S. Eliot captured this with his characteristic compression in 4 quartets, published between 1936 and 1942. He wrote of the need for old men, people who had learned what learning could teach, to be explorers, to set out again with the diminishment of age toward the condition of wonder that is the beginning of all genuine knowing. Knowledge that has become dead weight is knowledge that has stopped being in relationship with experience, that has detached from the living encounter and become the library of the already known, consulted only for confirmation. The remedy is not to discard the knowledge, it is to return it to living contact with experience, to bring it back into active relationship with what is actually happening in the world and in the interior. To be, in Eliot's phrase, still voyaging, still willing to be surprised by what the territory contains. The mind that knows a great deal and is still curious about what it does not know is not burdened by its knowledge, it is carried by it. Feel the weight of your own experience tonight, not as burden, as what has brought you to exactly this moment. Chapter 51. Humility before mystery. One of the most countercultural of Jung's positions in the culture of 20th century scientific rationalism, which was the water he swam in professionally, was his insistence that mystery was not an obstacle to understanding, but a condition of it. He was a scientist. He held that rigorously. His clinical observations were empirical. His case studies were documented. His hypotheses were formulated in ways that were, at least in principle, subject to revision by evidence. He took the methods of scientific inquiry seriously, even when what he was observing resisted the usual methods. But he was also very clear that the psyche contained things that rational analysis could approach but never fully contain. The symbol, the archetype, the experience of the numinous, the meaning that attached itself to certain encounters and experiences in ways that exceeded any theory he could construct to account for them. His response to this was not to explain it away. It was to maintain what he called a properly humble attitude before the mystery, to work at the edge of what was knowable without pretending the edge was farther than it was. This position, the position of the person who knows a great deal and remains genuinely humble before what they do not know, is extraordinarily rare in adult intellectual life, and it is one of the things that distinguishes the person who continues to grow from the person who has stopped. The person who is humbled by mystery does not experience that humility as defeat. They experience it as a form of accurate orientation. The world is genuinely large. Human understanding is genuinely partial. The appropriate response to this fact is not the despair of the person who wanted certainty and cannot have it, and not the resignation of the person who has given up trying to understand anything. It is the continued engagement of the person who is genuinely interested in what can be known, while genuinely honoring what cannot. Aristotle who lived from 384 to 322 BCE and established the foundational methods of empirical inquiry, began the metaphysics with an observation so simple it is almost too simple. All human beings by nature desire to know, not to have known. To know the present continuous, the ongoing activity. The desire does not stop when something is understood. It redirects to the next question, to the mystery that the answered question has revealed. That desire, kept alive, is the motor of the mind that does not grow old. Let the mystery of this night be what it is: the darkness, the quiet, the particular privacy of the hour. You are in it, and it is enough. Chapter 52. Self-worth beyond achievement. There is a version of the self that is entirely constituted by what it has done. This version has no independent existence. It is a function of its accomplishments, of the career, the relationships maintained, the problems solved, the impressions made. When the accomplishments are present and recognized, the self feels real and substantial. When they are absent or threatened, in illness, in failure, in the long diminishment of aging, the self feels, if not illusory, then dangerously thin. Jung observed this configuration in many patients. He called it the persona identification we discussed earlier, but in its specifically achievement-oriented form. The person who built their entire sense of worth on what they produced, which is, in the early decades of adult life, a very effective strategy. The world rewards production. The world confirms the worth of the person who produces well. For a long time, the strategy works. And then something changes. The career ends, or the body limits, or the children leave, or the recognition becomes thinner, or the person simply reaches a point in life where they encounter, for the first time, a question they cannot answer with output: what am I worth when I am not producing? The individuating psyche must eventually find an answer to this question that is not based on production. Not because production is bad, it is not, but because the self that has no ground outside of production has made itself hostage to an external condition that will eventually become unavailable. The philosopher and Jesuit priest Karl Rahner, who worked in the 20th century and whose theology was grounded in what he called the experience of mystery, wrote about what he called the absolute future, the orientation toward something that transcended all current conditions and that could not be taken away by the failure of any particular external circumstance. He was speaking from within a religious framework, but the psychological principle is available outside that framework. The self-worth that does not depend on achievement is the self-worth that comes from the person's relationship with their own interior, with the genuine encounter with the self, with the ongoing process of individuation, with the fact of being alive and engaged with what is real. This is the worth that belongs to the being, not the doing. It is the worth that remains when everything else has been stripped away, that Frankl identified in the concentration camps. that appeared in the stories of people who had lost everything external and found that the interior could still stand. You are worth more than what you have produced. You have always been. Let the body rest in that. Chapter 53. The body ages, symbols bloom. There is something quietly remarkable that happens in the second half of life if the person is paying attention. The body slows. The early physical competencies diminish, not all at once, not always dramatically, but gradually and unmistakably. The pace of recovery from exertion increases. Sleep changes. The face in the mirror changes. The body that was in earlier life primarily an instrument begins to become more clearly a condition, something that is happening to you, that you are inside, rather than something you deploy. And the psyche, in most people who have not closed themselves off from its influence, begins to do something that counterbalances this. It deepens into symbol. The things that carry meaning become more vivid, not less. The particular quality of afternoon light in autumn, the smell of a library, a piece of music heard first in a formative year, heard again now from the accumulated perspective of everything that has happened since, an old photograph, a handwritten letter, the face of someone who has been loved for a long time. These things mean something now that they could not have meant at 25. Not because the perceptions are more acute, they may be less acute, but because the symbol-making function of the psyche has accumulated enough material to bring to the encounter. The symbol is not just what it is. It is what it is in the context of everything it has recalled, and everything it has anticipated, and everything it has survived being part of. Jung wrote, in the later essays collected in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, that the second half of life was the period in which the psyche's orientation naturally shifted from the outer world, from the building, the accumulating, the achieving, the extending of the self into the world, toward the inner world. Not as a withdrawal, exactly, as a redistribution of attention, of energy, of the center of gravity. The person who makes this redistribution consciously, who cooperates with it rather than resisting it, often finds, to their surprise, that the inner world properly inhabited is richer than the outer world at its most promising. Not because the inner world is more comfortable, because it is more real. The body ages, and in the aging, something else begins to bloom. Feel where you are tonight, in this room, in this body, at this hour. All of it real, all of it yours. Chapter 54, Renewal through Honest Reflection. Self-knowledge has a bad reputation in certain quarters, because it has been associated with either painful excavation of the past or an excessive and self-indulgent preoccupation with the inner life. Neither of these associations is quite what we mean. Honest reflection, as Jung practiced and recommended, is something more practical. It is the periodic willingness to look at one's own responses, reactions, and patterns with the same quality of clear-eyed attention one might bring to the observation of anything else, not judgment. Not self-flagellation, observation. The Delphic oracle's instruction, "Know yourself," notheseoton in ancient Greek, was carved in stone at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era. It is one of the oldest surviving pieces of Western philosophical instruction, and what it meant in the context of a culture that understood the divine as something that worked through the interior as much as through the outer world was something more radical than self-improvement. It meant examine your own interior with the same seriousness with which you would examine the most important thing in the world, because it is. Seneca practiced this through the evening review, a habit he recommended in the letters to Lucilius and that he described as his own daily practice. Each evening, before sleep, he examined the day, not to judge himself for its failures, but to understand them, to trace the moment at which he had acted from something other than his best understanding, and to consider what had produced that deviation. This is not guilt, it is information. And information, used well, is the material of renewal. The person who reflects honestly, who can look at what they actually did today, not what they intended to do, and extract from the gap between the two something useful, is the person who is still learning, still in relationship with their own experience as a source of guidance rather than simply a sequence of things that happened. This is what keeps the mind in contact with its own life. And contact with your own life, genuinely maintained, is the most reliable form of renewal available. Tomorrow will be different from today. That difference is available precisely because this honest looking happened. Let the day go. What it had to teach has been received. Chapter 55. The Psyche rejects final answers. Here is one of Jung's most important observations. Simply stated, the psyche rejects final answers. Not because the psyche is evasive or perverse, because it is alive. And living systems do not have final states. They have ongoing processes. The person who has arrived at a final answer about what they are, about what the world is, about how life works and what it means, has, in effect, decided to stop being a living system in the relevant sense. They have traded the discomfort of ongoing process for the comfort of settled conclusion. This is understandable. The ongoing process is uncomfortable. It requires the tolerance of ambiguity, the willingness to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously without resolving them prematurely, the patience to allow questions to remain open until the evidence genuinely requires a conclusion. Most people have a limited appetite for this. But the psyche knows something that the ego does not. Final answers are not available about the most important things. What it means to love, what a life well lived requires, what the proper relationship is between self-interest and the claims of other people, what the self is, in the end, made of. These questions do not have final answers because the questions themselves change as the person asking them changes. The answer available to a person at 50 is different from the answer available at 30, not because the truth has changed, but because the person has more of what the truth requires to be understood. More experience, more suffering, more genuine encounter with the world and with their own interior. The question that seemed settled reopens. The answer that felt complete turns out to have been a resting point on a longer journey. And the psyche, faithful to its own nature, presents the next layer. The mind that embraces this, that has made its peace with ongoing process, that does not experience the reopening of settled questions as a failure, but as the continuation of the most interesting engagement available to a human being, is the mind that stays alive. Not comfortable, alive. We are nearly at the end. A few more chapters. Let your body rest in the closing movement of this night. Chapter 56. A flexible mind breathes. Let us pause here. Let your attention move to your breath, not to change it, just to find it, wherever it is. The small movement in the chest or the belly. The slight pause at the top of the inhale before the exhale begins. Your body has been breathing for as long as you have been alive. Through every night, through every dream, through every change of season and decade, without your instruction, without your supervision. Let it breathe now in the same way. You do not need to help it. The flexible mind, we said, does not bend because it is weak. It bends because it is alive. Wood that has dried too thoroughly, that has lost its moisture, its living quality, does not flex, it cracks. The living tree in the wind moves dramatically, loses branches sometimes, looks threatened, and then the storm passes and it stands. The flexible mind has a quality that is hard to name precisely, but easy to recognize in another person. It is present to what is actually happening rather than committed to what should be happening. It meets the reality it finds rather than the reality it expected. This requires a specific kind of courage, not the courage of confronting an external threat, which is more dramatic and therefore more celebrated, but the quiet courage of remaining genuinely open in conditions that push toward closure. The courage of staying curious when certainty would be more comfortable. The courage of continuing to question what has been assumed. The courage of remaining, at whatever age, a person to whom the world still has things to say. Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, wrote, "Water is the softest thing, yet it can penetrate mountains and earth." He was making an argument about the superiority of yielding over rigidity, not as moral instruction, but as observation about how the world actually works. The hardest things crack under sufficient force. The softest things flow around the obstacles and continue. The flexible mind is not the soft mind in the sense of lacking substance. It is the mind that has learned to move around what cannot be moved and through what can be, while remaining itself recognizable, coherent, genuinely itself throughout. That mind breathes. Breathe with it. Chapter 57. Wisdom without becoming cold. There is a temperature that wisdom maintains. It is not warm in the way that enthusiasm is warm, enthusiastically open genuinely interested. This quality of temperature in the wise person is different. It is not the warmth of conviction. It is not the warmth of affection, though it can include that. It is something more fundamental, the warmth of a person who has not, in the process of learning what they have learned, lost their capacity to be moved. The cold sage is a figure in many traditions, the philosopher who has achieved such distance from ordinary human concerns that they are unmoved by the things that move ordinary people. And this figure is always, in the deepest readings, understood to have gone wrong somewhere, not gained wisdom, but abandoned something essential to the pursuit of it. Jung was explicit about this. He believed that genuine psychological development, genuine individuation, necessarily included the development of the feeling function alongside the thinking function. The person who thought their way to wisdom without feeling their way there had produced something that was intellectually impressive but psychologically incomplete, and incomplete in a specific way. They had lost the capacity for genuine encounter with another person. Because genuine encounter requires that you be moved by the other person, that their reality register in you, affect you, change something in the interior landscape of your own experience. The person who cannot be moved cannot encounter, they can only observe. The warmth that wisdom retains is the warmth of the person who has been moved many times by beauty, by loss, by the particular weight of another person's suffering held close, and who has found in that being moved not weakness, but the sign of an interior that has remained alive. This is the warmth that the audience of this channel finds in Marcus Aurelius, in Frankl, in Winnicott, not because these figures were emotionally expressive in the performing sense, but because their writing is evidence of a person genuinely encountering experience, not managing it, not observing it from a safe distance, meeting it. The wise person is the person who has learned a great deal and remained soft enough to be touched by what they have learned, who has, in the language of Kintsugi, allowed the cracks to be filled with gold rather than sealed with something less valuable. Wisdom without warmth is erudition. Wisdom with warmth is presence. The room is quiet. You are present in it. Chapter 58. Peace in ongoing becoming. We have arrived near the end, and it is time to say something about peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace that comes when everything is settled, when the questions are answered, when the conflicts are resolved, and the interior is finally quiet. That peace is real and desirable, and comes in small doses at particular moments. But it is not sustainable as a permanent state because the interior is alive, and the interior in motion is not, by definition, finally quiet. The peace we are pointing toward is something else. The peace of a person who has found their relationship with ongoing becoming, who has made their settlement not with a finished self, but with the process of becoming one, who has accepted that the process does not end, and found in that acceptance a ground that is stable precisely because it is not dependent on any particular outcome. This is what Keats called negative capability in a letter written in December of 1817. He described it as the capacity to be in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. He was describing a quality of mind that could remain present in conditions of unresolvedness without the anxiety that typically accompanies that condition. Not because the uncertainty had been eliminated, but because the relationship to it had changed. Jung spent the last years of his life on a book that was published after his death in 1961, a book about what happened to the psyche after death, about the experience of dying and what, if anything, might continue. He wrote about it with the same quality of genuine inquiry that he brought to everything else. He did not claim to know. He explored that exploration at 85 in failing health, with the knowledge that he was very close to the end of his particular individual experience of being alive. That exploration was itself a form of ongoing becoming. He was still turning toward the mystery rather than away from it. The peace that is available in this condition is not the peace of having arrived, it is the peace of being genuinely underway. And being genuinely underway in the right direction, at whatever pace the body allows, is more than enough. Let that be enough tonight, for this hour, for this room, for whatever is moving in you slowly in the direction of your own fullest life. The closing movement of this night is near. Chapter 59, Resting Inside the Living Soul. A living soul does not rest in the way a machine rests. A machine at rest is simply off, inert, awaiting the next activation. When it is switched off, it is precisely what it is when it is running, the same components, the same structure, just not currently activated. A living soul at rest is doing something. Not dramatically, not in the way that is visible or productive, or that can be tracked or measured, but the metabolism of meaning continues. The unconscious continues its nightly generation of image and symbol and compensatory material. The body processes and repairs and renews. The nervous system, if it has found sufficient safety, settles into the particular quality of rest that allows the next day's encounter with the world to begin with some genuine freshness. Rest for the living soul is not an absence. It is a different mode of presence. The interior is present to itself in a way that the busy day does not allow. The thoughts that could not be heard over the noise of the day make themselves available. The emotions that were managed through the social demands of daylight hours release some of their held energy. This is why sleep matters psychologically, not only physically. The sleeping person is not only repairing their body, they are allowing the psyche to do its own repair, the nightly processing that the Jungian analyst James Hollis described as the soul's housekeeping. The sorting, the integrating, the generation of the dream material that, if attended to, reveals what the conscious day has not yet absorbed. The person who has lived well today, who has been present to some degree, who has encountered something genuinely, who has not entirely avoided their own interior rests more fully than the person who has spent the day on the surface. There is less unprocessed material waiting for the night's work. This is not an argument for perfection in the day. It is an observation about what allows the night to be fully what the night is meant to be. You are in the night now. The day is done. Whatever it contained, it contained. The night has received it. The living soul at rest is here, in this room, in this body, with this particular history and this particular interior and this particular quality of quiet. It is enough. It is more than enough. Let it rest. Chapter 60. Sleep for the Timeless Mind. It is late now. The room has been quiet for some time. Your body is heavier than it was at the beginning. The ceiling is the same ceiling. The darkness outside the window is the darkness of a night that has continued at its own pace, unhurried by what we have been saying or thinking or allowing ourselves to feel. We began with a question: what in you has not grown old? And we have explored 5 answers. Curiosity, the mind that keeps asking. Flexibility, the psyche that bends and returns. Play, the interior that has kept its access to genuine delight. The wound that teaches tenderness, the suffering that deepened rather than hardened. And individuation, the ongoing becoming that has no final chapter, only the next one. Carl Jung, who was with us throughout this night, did not offer these as instructions. He was a clinician who observed what the psyche did when it was left to do what it actually does, and what he observed consistently was that the psyche tended toward wholeness. That it worked with extraordinary patience and in its own circuitous ways toward the fullest expression of what the individual person could be. He observed that some people cooperated with this tendency, and those people, regardless of what had happened to them, regardless of how much or how little the outer world had offered them, tended to remain alive in a way that had nothing to do with the biological age of the body. "Who looks outside dreams," he wrote in a letter to a colleague whose name history has not preserved. "Who looks inside awakes." We have been looking inside tonight, not with a searchlight, not with the anxiety of the examiner, with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. That is enough. It has always been enough. The mind that stays young is not a young mind. It is a mind that has kept its relationship with its own depths. That has not allowed the surface to become the totality. That has, through curiosity and flexibility and play and suffering and the endless process of becoming, stayed in contact with the part of itself that is, in some essential way, always beginning. That is you, tonight, in this room, at this hour, beginning again with sleep. Let your eyes be where they are. Let your hands be where they are. Let your breathing move at whatever pace it finds. The night holds everything you have been and everything you are becoming, and the wide, patient space between them. Rest there. Sleep now.